Resident Evil, arguably the most popular horror franchise of all time. And if Resident Evil isn't your favourite horror series, I'm fairly certain that you still need to thank it for the endless horror franchises that spawned from this creation. And me personally, I have always absolutely loved these games. But I realised that there are still a lot of games in this series that I'm yet to play. Today, that changes thanks to you and the vote that took place a couple of months ago. Since 1996, there has been an unbelievable amount of releases with Resident Evil slapped on the front, and we are going to play every single one. Today, we are going to be examining every single thing that makes an RE game tick, from all of the wild and wacky stories, its colourful cast of characters, the game mechanics, the locations, the villains and bosses, and how scary each title is. And with that, we're going to stick them all in a list to find out definitively which is the greatest Resident Evil of all time, and which ones that you need to avoid at all costs. According to me, anyway. So folks, we have a hell of a lot to cover, starting back in 1996. So grab yourself a drink, grab yourself a snack, because we are going to be talking about Resident Evil for quite a considerable time. But without further ado, let's play every single Resident Evil that has ever existed. Let's begin. Where else would we begin than the original Resident Evil, the game that started it all? Developed and published by Capcom and released in 1996, the world truly wasn't ready for what this game would do to horror. So let's waste no time and break open one of the most important games in history. To begin with, the story. The date is July 1998, and the Bravo team of Raccoon City Special Tactics and Rescue Service, also known as STARS, are sent out to the Raccoon Forest to investigate a collection of cannibalistic murders. Soon after, contact is lost. Alpha Team is then sent out to try and piece together what happened to all parties involved. They soon find the crashed helicopter of Bravo Team, but are quickly ambushed by a pack of dogs, forcing them to take shelter inside of a mysterious mansion nearby. Firstly, they introduce us to the main cast of characters: Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Wesker, with a couple more faces that aren't really important, no offense to them. But my god, we have to talk about the cutscene that introduces them.
Strangely, most of the equipment was still there. We soon discovered
Look
why.
at Wesker! What the f is that?
No! Don't go!
Absolutely perfect late 90s cheese. So from this, we are then thrown into the game. Firstly, we pick our main character, either Jill or Chris, and even though both play the same, they do have slight differences that make them stand out a little on their own. For example, if you choose Chris, you'll be able to get more critical shots, dealing more damage, but Jill can carry more items in her inventory. It's also worth saying that the story changes depending on who you pick, and for the sake of this video not being a year long, I'm only going to be discussing the story and decisions of the one character who will play through. This time around, that would be Jill. But don't worry, for the remake, I'll be playing as Chris, so we can technically see what happens on both sides of the story. Now that we're controlling the character, the first point of discussion is the tank controls, as this is what immediately hit me in the face. Instead of following the character by either first or third person, we must control them from set camera points that change as we make our way through the environment. Now, tank controls aren't for everybody. They can be really janky at times, but thankfully, I was able to adapt to them fairly quickly, which is extremely lucky since we've got several tank control games ahead of us. When it comes to the basic movement, you'd have what you expect. You can walk and run freely, but when shooting, you will be locked into place and must pivot on the spot to attack, and this again can take some getting used to. But it's not a bad system at all, and at times I felt that this actually helped with the claustrophobia of scrapping against the undead in tight corridors and hallways. On that, it doesn't take long for us to encounter our first zombie either, and the reveal of it is easily one of the most iconic shots within the entirety of gaming. The first thing that shocked me though when tackling the undead was actually how much ammo it can take to put them down. These aren't your generic zombies that go down with a single pistol bullet or headshot. Instead, you may actually need to put 7 or 8 bullets in a single corpse for them to be down for the count. And this adds a really interesting level to Resident Evil that I'll talk about a bit later on. Now, two of the biggest focal points of the title are exploration and puzzles. As for most of your stay here, you'll be wandering through the halls going room to room to find key items, ammo and equipment that will take you further into the mansion. Now this does involve a hell of a lot of backtracking, and being totally honest, games that feel like nothing but fetch quests can bore the absolute hell out of me. I'm looking at you, Songs of Horror. But Resident Evil handles this well, and I never got bored once during my time exploring the incredible mansion and its subsequent sections. Don't get me wrong, it is quite easy to get lost in this title, as I did quite a bit, but over time I really found myself understanding the layout of pretty much all of the environments, to the point that even now I could probably recreate the map of the mansion from memory. Speaking of environments though, the ones provided in this title are absolutely fantastic. The eerie mansion that you begin in, to the bizarre outskirts, to the high-tech labs in the final section. All of the areas look absolutely fantastic nearly 30 years later, and all just add an incredible feel to this survival horror. Speaking of survival horror, it's time to open up how this game sets itself apart on the games that came before. Firstly, I would like to talk about inventory management, as this is a massive component to the game as well. With Jill, you have 8 dedicated slots for everything that you'll find on your travels. Different guns, ammo, puzzle pieces, healing herbs, keys, and all such take spaces in your inventory, and if you don't manage it well, you will soon find yourself in tricky situations. Carry too much ammo and guns and you won't have enough slots to carry the necessary puzzle pieces that take you further into the game. But on the other side, if you carry too many quest items, you might find yourself in a room of the undead with hardly any ammo or herbs to protect yourself. So you really have to balance your inventory as best as you can to avoid hard situations in the future. As I previously said as well, zombies don't go down easy, so something that I found myself doing often was actually ignoring them and trying to just sprint past sections to preserve ammo that I'd found, as it could be quite scarce. Choosing which fights to engage with and which to run from is crucial to your survival in this, as every herb and every bullet counts in the long run. The game does throw a couple of lifelines though, normally in the way of safe rooms. In here you'll obviously have the chance to save, however even saving isn't as simple as you'd think, as to do so you must spend ink ribbons. If you don't have any, you cannot save, so that is yet another commodity that you need to make sure you maintain well. In these rooms though are item boxes, another classic staple of the franchise. Here you can store items for later, and stockpiling useful stuff can save your life in the future, so all of these components must be constantly thought about during your travels. Now, so far I have only mentioned zombies, however you'll be facing a hell of a lot more than that. Infected dogs, spiders, hunters, demonfish and mutants are just a couple of the creatures that you'll fight throughout the game, and I for one enjoyed pretty much every enemy that you fight across the board. They all bring something new to the table. The spiders, for example, are ginormous, they spit poison at you, and when killed, smaller spiders then erupt from the body that you must deal with as well. Whereas the weird lab mutants known as chimeras can run along the ceilings and have unbelievable power and fast attacks. So these creatures to me are a prime example of running away is sometimes better than fighting. I honestly wasn't expecting such a varied cast of monsters to face. I knew there was a decent amount, but it was shocking on how many different foes you'll actually face throughout the game. With that, let's quickly talk about more of the story that develops through your time, and it all revolves around a company called Umbrella. Now, I'm sure you are all familiar with this name, but just in case you're not, Umbrella is a pharmaceutical company on the surface, but beneath they are conducting experiments on biological weaponry for militaries across the world, and their creation is the Tyrant virus, also known as the T-virus, and that is what has spawned all of these nightmarish creatures. Whilst figuring out what Umbrella has been doing behind closed doors, we also have a surprise reveal as well. It turns out that Wesker is a bad guy and has been working with Umbrella for decades, and is one of the main reasons that the T-virus exists. He brought the STARS team to the mansion to conduct experiments on behalf of Umbrella to get data on how their creatures fight. But at the end of the game, it's basically said that Wesker actually only works for himself and betrays Umbrella too. But we'll get more into Wesker later, as future games do a much better job of explaining his ambitions and goals. There are a couple more twists and turns, and honestly some of the characters have some really good plot points and arcs. I'm looking at Barry for this one. So the story was actually something that I was quite pleasantly surprised with. It's also worth saying that I feel like the story to these games compares to the Souls-like in a regard, as you are given very basic and surface level information on who you are, why you're here, and what you're doing. But to really understand all of the pieces in place, you'll have to piece that together by collecting notes and journals throughout the game that just add tons to the lore of the title. This works well for me, as I've always loved researching everything that I could about what actually happened in these games, so that's a point of praise also. But folks, with that, it's now time to talk about the bosses that you'll fight in this game, and honestly, I loved them all. Since Umbrella have been experimenting on God knows how many creatures and animals, you will occasionally fight a unique enemy that is absolutely terrifying. From Yawn, the gigantic virus snake, the bizarre plant 42, and even the ultimate life form in the Tyrants, these bosses look fantastic and are quite intimidating on the surface. However, I do have a small negative here, that in this game the bosses are hilariously easy to defeat. I beat almost every single one on my first try with only a couple of bullets. The most notable was Plant 42. I defeated this creature before it even had chance to attempt a single attack on me. So however cool they look, I do wish they were harder to defeat. Even Yawn and the Tyrant go down much faster than you'd expect, so definitely a negative, but they still look incredible and are iconic through and through. With all of that, however, the game ends once you defeat the Tyrant. A helicopter comes back to save the day and Jill and Barry escape with only seconds left to spare, as the Umbrella facility self-destructs. Wesker has vanished, Chris is alive but missing as well, so it's just Barry and Jill as they fly into the sunset on a job well done. That is essentially the first title, and folks, this game is so much fun, and still a masterpiece nearly 30 years later. Now, I actually can't remember if I've played this game before. If I did, it must have been when I was very young. So other than the iconic moments, there wasn't too much that I remembered. But folks, I had such a blast with this game, and I was absolutely amazed that it was as enjoyable as it was for how dated it is. The controls take some getting used to, but once you do, you'll have no problems at all. The environments look phenomenal, they really do. The cutscenes and dialogue for this are some of the most iconic in the series, and you know exactly what I mean by that.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
Hey! He said the thing, he said the thing. One of the things that I noticed that did surprise me a bit as well was the lack of background music for this game. There isn't that many sections that has music tied to them, only the cutscenes, jump scare moments, and the safe room, of course. It took me quite a while to realise the lack of music, but again, I think it works in the game's favour of making everything feel really tense and on edge. Also, speaking of jump scare moments, we need to discuss how scary this game is. And folks, for the most part, the scares and atmosphere do work fairly well. Now, it's not the scariest game by far, but it's definitely given me a couple of great jump scares that didn't feel cheap, which is impressive in itself. Even though it might have been very scary at the time, by today's standards, it just isn't that scary anymore. But it's not a problem. On the whole, Resident Evil is still an absolute masterpiece. And if you folks haven't played this game yet, I cannot stress how much you should. Not only are you playing a massive piece of gaming history, but it holds up unbelievably well for, again, it being nearly 30 years old. So, of course, Resident Evil is going to be going into the #1 spot, but my god does it deserve it. The only thing that I wish that they did different in this game was make the bosses harder. That is literally it. It is an absolute masterpiece nearly 30 years later still. As expected, Resident Evil was an unbelievable commercial and critical success. It revolutionized horror overnight and spawned countless iconic survival horror series alongside it, so people couldn't wait to see what would come next. And only 2 years later, we found out. But before we continue any further, we of course need to talk about today's sponsor, StarCraft X. Now, for those who unfortunately don't know, StarCraft X is a free-to-play hardcore PvPvE extraction shooter set in the gigantic Chernobyl exclusion zone, where every mission is unique, tense, and full of danger. There are a plethora of reasons to give this game a go for the first time, or to go back as a more seasoned player. From the enormous open-world sandbox that will keep you on your toes every minute you spend surviving, to the countless dangers that lurk in the shadows. Mutants, anomalies, factions, random events, and real stalker players. Every encounter will test you, but with those tests come rewards. With tons of customization options, you can style craft the perfect experience. Whether you want to go in guns blazing or prefer the silent and deadly option, you can take whatever route you find most appealing. But be careful, in this unforgiving wasteland, just one wrong move can result in your enemies zombies claiming all of the glory for themselves, and all of that loot that you were carrying, of course. But with seasonal events, wild zones, clan wars, factions, and the new operations mode that's coming soon, there's hundreds of hours worth of content to explore here, completely for free, and the amount of things to do is only going to rise. So folks, get yourself into the zone by clicking my link in the description or the pinned comment, and use code SM25JAZZY to grab some free exclusive rewards to give you the edge you need to survive. And of course, a massive thank you to StyleCraftX for sponsoring this video. But back to the regularly scheduled programming. Released in 1998, Resident Evil 2 had some massive shoes to fill, but Capcom were confident that they'd hit the nail on the head yet again. New characters, new locations, and new enemies to encounter, they were swinging for the fences. But did they knock it out of the park? Well, let's find out. As always, the story. Resident Evil 2 continues 2 months after the events of the first game, and follows 2 brand new characters, Leon Kennedy, a rookie cop with the RPD, and Claire Redfield, who, yes, is Chris's sister from the first game. Only moments into the title, however, the zombies emerge in an all-new city outbreak. After getting separated, the plan is to meet up at Raccoon City Station, and not only stop the infection, but find Chris as well. The introduction to Resident Evil 2 is a lot more wild than the first. Instead of starting in a quiet mansion where things slowly fall into place, here, the moment we control our character for the first time, we're in a burning, destroyed street with the infected already hunting us down. So we've got to move, and fast. Now, gameplay wise, things feel pretty much identical to before, at least in regards to the movement, gunplay, and general gameplay loop of puzzles, backtracking, and that sort of thing. And this really is not a problem. If it isn't broke, no need to fix it. But we do have a couple of small quality of life changes. Firstly, the inventory screen looks better and is a touch easier to navigate, and I don't know if this is a placebo effect as well, but I would say I had a much easier time with movement around the levels here. Leon seems to react better to my movements than I did in the first game, and that's quite important, as another component of Resident Evil 2 that I noticed pretty quickly was the significant increase of enemies that you have to face or dodge. The game no longer has 3 enemies in a single area at most. In most places, they seem to have been doubled, as the streets alone are quite full with the undead, making the choice of engaging with them or running around them a little bit more dire this time around, and I for one enjoyed that a lot. This also has the effect that Resident Evil 2 is definitely harder than the first game, at least to me, and I'm not just talking about the amount of enemies that you face itself. I found myself struggling a little bit more than I did in the first game, but honestly, this is my first point of praise. Now, one of my negatives for the first title is that it felt a little bit easy, especially the bosses, where here I would say the difficulty was pretty spot on. I wasn't gliding my way through each section with ease. I also wasn't pulling my hair out either. So I would say that the balance is already a lot better. More enemies means that the world needs to be filled with more resources, and you'll run into plenty, with ammo and healing herbs definitely becoming more common than they were. Again, it is strongly balanced in my eyes, and I never really felt like I had too many lifelines, as if I didn't manage my resources well, then it would turn around and bite me in the ass as it did previously. Now, the street locations are absolutely fine, but once you reach the infamous RPD station, the game truly begins in my eyes. Firstly, this location is easily one of, if not the most iconic place within the entirety of Resident Evil. This is the very first time we set foot in this location, and considering I'm a lot more used to the RPD in the remake and within Dead by Daylight, seeing it like this for the first time was honestly amazing, and it holds up super well. Considering this released only a couple of years later, the graphics and the locations that you'll find yourself in all look phenomenal, and are definitely an improvement to what came before. The police department, the prison and sewer sections, and of course the lab at the end, they look absolutely brilliant, and again are just another great improvement on what came before. With that, let's move on to the enemies that you will fight throughout your time here in Raccoon City, both regular foes and the big bad villains of the game. So of course, the main enemy that you'll be facing throughout are the zombies infected again by Umbrella's T-Virus. On the most part, they act very similarly to what came before, but it's also very clear that there's a much larger and varied number of models here as well. On the surface in the streets, you'll find generically dressed zombies. In RPD, they can be in police uniforms, and in the lab, they are disgusting and naked. So again, zombies are great. However, we of course course have a new few additions. The most notable are without question the Lickers, horrible mutants that can shred you to pieces if they find where you are. But giant Lickers and their giant tongues have a very exploitable weakness. They are completely blind. So walking past them is absolutely an option here, and honestly, to me, it is the preferred one. But I also do love fighting these creatures, as they are easily one of my favourite enemy types in the entire series. I will take Lickers over Hunters any day. But I did mean that they are powerhouses, so prepare for a tough scrap if you decide to take them on. Other than that, we do get a little bit more with spiders, moths, and weird plant creatures as well, and they all do a great job. The bosses, on the other hand, oh my lord, they really went above and beyond for the big fights in this game. Firstly, we get some of the most iconic villains in the Resident Evil series with Mr. X, a brand new tyrant whose sole purpose is to track down a new sample of the G-Virus and eliminate any survivors within RPD. He is pretty much unstoppable unless you have some incredible weapons on you, so your only choice when he finds you is to run. The other iconic villain is Dr. William Birkin, who is the creator of the G-Virus. And throughout the entire series, we will see a complete Argos catalogue of parasites, viruses, and bacteria that all do something a little bit different. Now, I am going to try my absolute hardest to make sure that I get all of the facts right on these viruses, but you'll have to bear with me because they do get quite complicated. Anyway, moving on. Long story short, Dr. William Birkin was a professor under Umbrella and was working on a new strain of virus that he called the G-Virus. However, Birkin was mortally wounded and ended up injecting himself with his own G-Virus creation. As you would imagine, this goes pretty badly, and from this he mutates into a tyrant. But not just a regular tyrant, as the G-Virus is one that forever mutates its host. You fight this chap many times throughout the story, and every time you face him, he's mutated again and has grown not only in size but in destructive power as well. This is a phenomenal idea for a boss that constantly evolves alongside the player and becomes a bigger risk every time you face him. These two bosses for me really make Resident Evil 2 stand out that bit more, and thankfully the bosses this time around are no pushovers. Each one killed me multiple times, and I would say that they are also perfectly balanced here. When a big boss turned up, it was a pleasure to fight, and that's only mentioning these two. There are a few more that pop up during your playthroughs, like giant moths and crocodiles, but this game does a much better of job at setting up the bosses as actual characters that matter to the story, not just one-off creature fights that you kill and move on from. So yes, even though for the most part you'll be fighting the same bosses, their mutations allow you to connect further to them, and with them ever changing, you'll have to adapt every single time you fight them, and I loved this. The bosses here are phenomenal. That's not the only improvements you'll spot throughout this title though, as Resident Evil 2 does a much more fantastic job of linking the storylines between certain characters. For example, you can now choose to take or leave items for your subsequent runs, also known as the zapping system. For example, in Leon's A run, you'll eventually find a lock containing a gun and an inventory space upgrade. At first, you get to pick one and leave the other for the next character's playthrough, or like me, you can just take them both. But I really like this premise, and it pops up a couple of times throughout the game. Next, of course, it's time to talk about the characters, cutscene, and the rest of the story. Folks, you'll not be surprised in the slightest when I say that Resident Evil 2 improves on all of these across the board as well. Not only are there a lot more cutscenes in this game than the first, but they are so much better. The voice acting is also still a great level of 90s cheese, but there is a noticeable improvement here too. No disrespect, as I love the characters from the first game, but here I feel like you connect to Leon and Claire a lot more than you do Jill and Chris. But it's not just the main characters, as this game is full of wacky and interesting side characters that you'll meet throughout. Marvin, the gun shop owner, Ada, who will become another main character of the series, and Chief Irons all have their own agenda and story that fits in well with the narrative at play, giving the player a much more involved and diverse cast that are extremely interesting, and it's always fun to see them interact and find out more as you go throughout the game. There is also a lot bigger focus on gore than the first title as well, as not only does shooting enemies produce a lovely amount of blood, which I'm always a fan of, but the game just really has some incredible shots, like where Marvin transforms into a zombie, or the prisoner's death scene as a couple of really great examples, which definitely help make this a better horror game as well. Now, for the rest of the story, after a while it does become a bit of a mirror of the previous game. We find out that Chris isn't in Raccoon City anymore and is on a job himself in Europe, so it becomes the trope of shutting down the evil lab and stopping the big bad boss of the game, which is absolutely fine, as the character improvements and the story beats that I've mentioned previously definitely make this a stronger story in my eyes than the last, even if it ends quite similar to the last game. Yeah, folks, Resident Evil 2 is an extremely strong title. To me, pretty much every single thing that made the first game as iconic as it is has only been tweaked and improved on the sequel. The tone, the characters, the gameplay, the puzzles, combat, music, it is all extremely top notch, and I cannot sing its praises highly enough. The last thing that we need to discuss, though, are the scares, and honestly, for the most part, the game is about as scary as the original, in terms of tone and jump scares. Don't get me wrong, this game feels a lot darker and more dire than it did in the first, but I didn't find myself being more scared as a result from that. So it comes as a surprise to nobody that I put Resident Evil 2 at the new number 1. This game is an absolute masterpiece, it truly is. Pretty much every single aspect has been improved on from the original, and Capcom delivered exactly what they promised us within this title. And again, if you haven't played it before, I would absolutely beg you to give it a go. So, 2 games released and 2 masterpieces produced. It's safe to say that Resident Evil was really starting to make a big name for itself, and as before, people could not wait to see what came next. Now, for the next title, there was a touch of complications behind the scenes on what Resident Evil 3 would look like, but only a year later, it released, and with it came my absolute favourite villain in the entire series. So we've arrived at the finale of the initial PS1 trilogy, and from what I remember, Resident Evil 3 was the classic game that I remember enjoying the most when I was younger, and that's for one reason and one reason alone: Nemesis. He is easily my favourite villain throughout the entire series, but it's been many years since I last played, so let's give it another go and see if it still holds up. Now, the story for 3 is actually one of the simplest plot lines in the entire series. We once again play as Jill Valentine, and our only objective is to evacuate Raccoon City before it's blown sky high. Complications arise as you'd expect, as this time we are hunted by a new and terrifying bioorganic weapon, known as the Nemesis. His only job is to track down and kill every STARS member, as they want to cover up the fact that Umbrella is responsible for the outbreak. That's pretty much it, folks. We of course meet new characters and complications throughout, but there isn't really more to talk about, to be honest. So, with the story wrapped up, let's see what it's about. Now, first things first, Resident Evil 3 shares a hell of a lot of similarities between the last 2 games, and I would say that this is the one with the least innovation between titles. And that's not a bad thing, but it does mean that we have slightly less to talk about, as combat movement puzzles are pretty much exactly what you'd expect, but we do have some small tweaks. Firstly, the biggest addition to combat and movement is that Jill now has the ability to dodge. It can be tricky to get down at first, but the first Nemesis boss fight is actually a fantastic little training area for you to get the timing down, and it is a decent mechanic, but it has a big problem. For me, it is just not consistent at all. The dodge can go through, but if you're, for example, backed up against a wall, chances are you will still take the hit, and because it's bound to the exact same button as shooting, well, you can imagine some of the problems that come from this. So it is a good thought, but it's not implemented the best here to me. The next new addition I would like to talk about are the gunpowders. Now, when you pick up throughout the games, there are various types of gunpowder that, when combined in particular ways, will grant the player ammo for a particular weapon. A fine new addition that I definitely took advantage of here, and it is something that we will see a lot more throughout the series. Other than that, there are a smattering of new additions, such as environmental hazards being added, so exploding barrels and similar types of explosives are in for the first time, but most of the tweaks have come to the story and progression of the game. Firstly, Resident Evil 3 definitely feels a lot quicker paced than the games that came before. I actually would call this more of an action game than a pure slow-paced horror, like the previous in the series. As firstly, there is again more zombies on screen than ever before, and to deal with them you need bigger weapons that deal damage fast, which is definitely a contributor to the faster paced gameplay. It's also worth saying that Resident Evil 3 is a lot more linear than previous titles. Now, there of course is still a small amount of backtracking that you'll need to do, but nowhere near the same level that came before, as when you travel through Raccoon City you will notice that it is nowhere near as interconnected as the previous titles as well. The last new addition that we got to see in this game are the live selection choices, where randomly throughout the game you will be given an option between A or B. One could be run, the other could be fight, for example. And even though you may think that these choices can affect the story and progression quite a lot, and whilst yes, technically that is the case, for the most part the choices that you make aren't really that crazy, and don't change as much as you'd expect. So I do wish that they went a little bit further with this, as really I was expecting some more dramatic differences that would totally change things, and give this game a lot more replayability. But most of the time your choices will be either to run or to fight. Now of course, we can't talk about Resident Evil 3 Nemesis without discussing Nemesis. As I said, this hulking monster is easily my favourite creature in the entire series. He, without question, has one of the most intimidating presences, and he is absolutely no pushover. If you choose to fight this monster, then be prepared to die a lot. He hits hard, he hits often, and is a complete bullet sponge. Not only that, but if you do manage to take this super mutant behemoth down, then you'll actually be rewarded with some pretty decent weapon upgrades, which make me stand on business every time and try to get the upper hand over this maniac. But there is a big problem for me that I hope I can convey well without people thinking that it's just a skill issue, and that's the boss fights in this game, including Nemesis. For me, the issue stems from tank controls versus enemies that don't abide by that limitation. A great example is Nemesis himself, but every boss in this game suffers from the same problem. So many times whilst trying to fight this dude, I would run away and try to spin to fill him with lead. But by the time that I've actually managed to create some space, Nemesis would instantly run up on me with no problems and punch me in the head, which got so annoying really quick. This is meant to be evened out by the aforementioned dodge mechanic, but since that's not reliable in the slightest, it left me frustrated on so many occasions, which is a real shame, as the boss fights should be the highlight of a Resident Evil game, and not the part that frustrates the player the most. When it comes to the setting and locations of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, I would like to say that firstly, this game is easily the best looking of the PS1 trilogy, and walking through and exploring all that Raccoon City has to offer was honestly fantastic. It's the most classic location for the series, so being able to go through it properly was so much fun. I also need to mention that Resident Evil 3 is also easily the shortest Resident Evil to date, and my entire playthrough just took over 3 hours. Now it makes sense since it is a touch more action forward and linear, but this was a little disappointing to me. Just when I was really starting to get into the game, it was pretty much over. So I do wish that we would have had a few more locations to travel through, but it is what it is, I suppose. The last point that I need to mention is the Mercenaries mode. Now this is a mode that was first introduced here, but it appears in most of the Resident Evils moving forward in one way or another. It's very simple in premise. You have a timer, you have things to kill everything before the timer runs out. Now it does get a touch deeper than that, but that's the basic premise. Now I'm not actually going to be talking too much about Mercenaries mode here or in the future games, as firstly they are all pretty much the same game type moving forward, but I'm actually going to be saving the bulk of what I have to say for a future entry specifically, as if I get into it here, that game section of the video will be like 20 seconds long, so you'll have to bear with me a little bit for that. Now honestly, Resident Evil 3 wasn't as good as I remember and not what I hoped it to be, but that doesn't mean that it is a bad game in the slightest. However, I would say that it is the weakest of the trilogy. As I said, not a bad game at all. I just wish that they'd pushed the boat out just that little bit further. With that, that's the original PS1 trilogy done and dusted. But before we get into the next of the mainline entries, we have our very first spin-off. And honestly, it's trying something quite ambitious. We have finally arrived at the first black sheep of the Resident Evil family. Now, truth being told, I never even knew this game existed before taking on this video. However, my Twitch chat were very kind to warn me that I was not going to be in for a good time here. However, I like to give every game I play a fair shot, so let's break open Survivor and see exactly what all of the fuss is about. As all Resident Evils start, we awake in the middle of a zombie apocalypse after a helicopter crash. Who are we? Well, that's a great question, because our main character hasn't got a sausage. He's got amnesia and has forgotten absolutely everything. We don't know who we are, why we're here, and what to do. All we are shown is a rather sharply dressed Umbrella employee bringing down the helicopter that we're on, resulting in our lack of everything. So, that's the intro. Let's get straight into the game. Now admittedly, Survivor marks a brand new page for Resident Evil, as we finally have our first taste of a first-person shooter experience in a fully 3D environment. Now I'm sure many of you are aware that the original games were actually supposed to be first-person shooters, but hardware limitations meant that we got the masterpieces that we know instead. So I was already very curious to see how this very first attempt plays out. It doesn't take us long though to find the corpse of the maniac that brought the chopper down, Ark Thompson, a hilarious name of course, but before we can question his parents' decision, boom, and zombie. As you'd expect, we have a pistol and waste no time in blasting him to hell. Now unlike previous Resident Evil games, the pistol in this has unlimited ammo, so you can spray all day and never run out of bullets here. Throughout the game as well, you do unlock the expected guns that you've seen throughout the series, the shotgun, the magnum, and the grenade gun as a couple of examples. Unfortunately though, these don't share unlimited ammo, so I saved them for bigger encounters than a room with just a single zombie or two inside. Now, one of the first and biggest changes that I notice is that this game is extremely linear. You will hardly be backtracking in this title at all, as it's pretty obvious where you have to go and the most you'll face on your way is a locked door. But the key is always in the room next to it, so you're never searching for that long. Not only that, but this game has a grand total of 0 puzzles. Not a single one. I didn't know what to expect with this title, but a Resident Evil game with no puzzles definitely rings alarm bells for me. So with no puzzles and no backtracking, I don't think you'll be surprised to know that this is one of the shortest Resident Evil experiences anybody can have. And I beat this game in just under 2 hours, and that was including a few breaks. But I'm getting ahead of myself. How does the game feel and is it fun?
Not a chance.
So let's figure out why. Firstly, the enemies for the most part aren't really that fun to engage with. You'll enter a room and there'll be a couple of zombies or a couple of dogs, or sometimes if you're super unlucky, a couple of hunters. But you deal with them all the same, just spam until dead. Most of the time you'll actually kill whatever's in the room long before it gets to you, and that's even if you want to engage with them, as shooting them can be a bit janky due to the fact that every successful shot centers the screen on what you've just shot at. So trying to aim at a cluster of dogs that are moving really quickly is impossible, as your reticle will fly all over the shop. But the even simpler fix is to just not shoot them at all. The dogs will literally never attack you if you're moving. They just circle you as prey constantly without any of them actually having the balls to give your ankle a nibble. And once you figure this out, you'll never shoot a dog again. So regular NPCs aren't handled the best, but unique enemies and bosses should be good, right? If anything, they are really underwhelming as well. The main bosses that you'll fight throughout your time here are the tyrants that get dropped around the level. 90% of the time, by just spamming your pistol, you will kill them long before they ever reach you, which was really a letdown. And they just don't spend any time whatsoever hyping these enemies up. I mean, the very first one that you face just walks at you menacingly. No special music, no cutscenes, nothing. You walk through a door and then he just starts slowly walking towards you. The only unique fights in this game that I would actually say gave me a spot of panic would be the 2 spiders that you fight under the bridge, but they're still quite easy to avoid, or it'll be the hunters, which are just the staple wankers of the Resident Evil franchise. Hunters need dealing with, or they will pummel you into the floor rather speedily. The final boss does get a bit of credit, I suppose, as he actually has a bit of health, meaning that you can't just kill him instantly. But the routine of that is now just trading shots off with him healing and hope you kill him first. So again, there's really nothing to it. Oh, and I have to mention these bizarre Special Forces military goons. I have no idea why, but they sound like panthers when you shoot them. It makes absolutely no sense and they all pretty much die in a single bullet. Like, they just didn't try at all with any of these enemies or creatures. For an entire game revolved around shooting, they unfortunately didn't make the shooting as fun as they could have. But the story. We of course need to know where that intriguing and gripping start goes. Throughout the game, you start to piece together that the villain of this title is Vincent, and that's the character you're playing as. Or at least that's what the game wants you to think. Children run away from you, and an old man calls you Vincent as he tries to kill you. But I never believed for a second that I was actually Vincent, because surely the villain of the game is the Timu Wesker wannabe in the silver suit with the Umbrella logo plastered all over his costume at the start of the game. And yes, that's exactly the case. We are in fact Ark Thompson, and we have been sent here to investigate the Umbrella facility. Whilst trying to do so, we fight with the real Vincent and he rips off our dog tags in the skirmish, holding onto them until the moment he falls from the helicopter. There is also a plot point of you helping two young kids off the island, but that doesn't really go anywhere either. Just ammo for our hero to continue to do his best, I guess. Folks, the story is very weak in my opinion. If they'd actually spent a bit more time though fleshing it out, I honestly feel like this could have been quite a fun reveal, but it was far too obvious to me from the get-go. Again, another dose of wasted potential. The next thing that I really need to mention are the cutscenes and the dialogue, because Jesus wept, they are both really bad in this title as well. Firstly, the cutscenes bounce between two different renders, with one clearly being better than the other. When it swaps between the two, it can get really noticeably bad. For example, there's a scene where the young boy who you're trying to save is pushed over the barrier by a hunter. The intro to this scene looks terrible, but when you actually go to grab the kid's hand, the scene looks much better. And this happens constantly throughout the game. There is no consistency and the voice acting is absolutely awful. From the main character,
Vincent, it's me, your mother.
My mother?
The weird moments you hear throughout the journey,
Thank you. You are a good boy, Lot.
and even the announcer for the facility's self-destruct sounds really bad as well.
The self-destruction system has been activated.
For a game that came after Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 that all had significantly better animations, models and voice acting, it's really noticeable as a downgrade in this title as well. Finally, the last thing that I need to mention is the music, and for the most part, it's not actually too bad. There is certainly a lot more music in this game than the ones that came before, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. While it does have some decent high-octane soundtracks to cover boss fights and the occasional jump scare which do land well, there is also some really bad music that I couldn't help but laugh at, especially when you enter the Umbrella facility at the end. Actual clown music. Unfortunately, folks, the rumours are true. This Resident Evil is quite bad. Gameplay isn't handled well, the enemies are boring at best and laughable at worst, the story is absolutely pointless, the boss fights are easier than the NPCs, and the entire game is only 2 hours long, which looking back on it now feels like a blessing. So with that, Survivor is going straight to the bottom of the pile, and I think you can understand why. Now, it wasn't a great game, but I do think there was something decent buried under here. But the game that we were given, I can definitely say you're missing nothing if you don't play it. Thankfully though, it means that things can only get better. Well, surprisingly, the very next title would come out the same year, and this would promise to be the best and most ambitious Resident Evil to date. So, when I said that the next Resident Evil came the same year, what I actually meant is pretty much a week later. Code Veronica arrived in February of 2000, and once again, I didn't have a chance to play this before. And unlike Survivor, all I'd heard is actually really good things about Code Veronica. So much so that the demand for a remake of this game is one of the highest in the series. So once again, let's break it open and see what Code Veronica has going for it. It's been 3 months since the destruction of Raccoon City, and we once again play as Claire looking for her missing brother Chris. It opens with a pretty surprising action-packed cinematic of Claire embarrassing some soldiers and even a chopper. However, it's not good enough and we get captured. When we regain consciousness, we're trapped in a prison cell, but things have already gone south. So the injured guard releases us and wishes us luck on escaping this new dangerous and zombified environment. Straight away, we are greeted with the biggest difference compared to the games that came before, as here we seem to have the perfect blend of tank controls with 3D environments. So you'll still have your classic dynamic shots of rooms and such, but the camera will track the player accordingly with a variety of shots on top. So already a nice upgrade, as it feels just like the classic Resident Evil experience, but a bit more refined and cinematic. Literally the best of both worlds. Other than that, there aren't actually too many changes to the base mechanics that you might expect. Movement and the inventory system still pretty much work identically to what came before, same with saving, combat and exploration. This is absolutely a classic feeling Resident Resident Evil through and through, as you explore your way through the world trying to find puzzle pieces and keys that let you go deeper into the story. Now, even though the feeling is still the same, Code Veronica has put a lot more sauce into the exploration part of the game, as every single location that you visit throughout your time here is honestly enormous. Sometimes it can work in the game's favour, like I enjoyed the Antarctica sections, but sometimes the locations do linger a bit more than you'd like, and because the environments are so huge, it also takes much longer to find key items and such, and you will get lost all the goddamn time. Code Veronica is easily the most map dependent I've been in the series so far. After every other door, I'd be checking to see where I am and where I need to go, because it's not like the mansion in the first game that you'll slowly get to know well by the end. This, along with some really complex and niche puzzles, also results in Code Veronica being one of the longest games in the series, at nearly double the amount of time it takes to beat than the previous entries. Now, on the surface, that's not really a bad thing maybe. You simply get more game, and if you love it, you're in for a treat. However, if you're not a fan, it can become quite the slog. Soon after you break free from prison, you'll be greeted with your partner for the game, the character that you keep bumping into and relying on throughout your time. And folks, it gives me no pleasure in introducing you to Steve. This guy is easily one of the worst characters through the entirety of Resident Evil. He's written as an absolute bellend, and the voice acting is another level of terrible.
Oh yeah, that felt good. Don't worry, Claire. Your knight in shining armor is here. Father!
But throughout the campaign, every single time this guy showed up on screen, I'd audibly groan, because I knew I was in for a terrible time. Through awful dialogue, questionable motives, and a scene where he genuinely goes to assault Claire as she's unconscious but stops when she starts to wake up, the choices they made for this dude are absolutely baffling. But not only that, they also frame Steve to be Claire's love interest, and this royally pissed me off. Steve is not somebody that is worthy of Claire's time and energy, let alone her interest like that. He is a terrible person, but the game forces you to try to connect to the romance, and it just absolutely does not work. The only time I cheered when Steve was on the screen was when he died. Genuinely one of the best moments in the game.
I love you.
Oh, piss off. You've known her for 2 days. Ugh. Although, let's go, he's dead.
Steve?
Thank God.
Steve?
Now, the problem with that for me is Steve could have been a great character. A 17-year-old wannabe cocky tough guy being thrown into a nightmare situation. It could have led to a fantastic character arc and story, but he just doesn't get any of that, and personally, I never want to see Steve again. So the side partner doesn't work in the slightest and is horrible, but let's move on to the enemies, the creatures, and the bosses for this title. And folks, I'm really sorry to say, but for the most part, I'm not a fan here either. The basic zombies that you fight throughout though are honestly great. They look incredibly varied in their design, and you will face a ton of different types throughout your stay here. Unfortunately, the other types of creatures that you fight, I'm really not a fan of. Hunters return, and they work the same as before, so they're fine. But they also introduce a new type of enemy that I like to call the Mr. Fantastics, as their entire moveset is just throwing an arm out and hitting you no matter where you are in the room compared to them. And my God, these guys are so boring to fight. Other than the occasional moth or dog as well, that's pretty much all you're going to be fighting throughout the title, and it was such a letdown to me personally, but it's not the worst I've ever seen. The bosses, however, absolutely are. I can't sugarcoat it, folks, but the bosses in this game are a complete and utter joke. They are appalling. Now, there's a couple of decent scraps, don't get me wrong. The worm fight is good, the first Alexia fight is decent, and the dude on the rooftop can definitely be fun, but goddamn, the rest of the bosses in this game are absolutely miserable to face, and feel like the most unfair Souls-like boss. Take the plane tyrant, for example. You have to fight this dude in the back of a plane, you are given no space to fight him, no ammo or resources, because to get to this fight you have to use a bunch of your stuff, and this results in an extremely extremely torturous experience where you are constantly hit because dodging his attacks is just not possible due to how small the arena you're fighting in is. And even if you do get a bit of damage in, unless you've stockpiled the best stuff ahead of time, you're going to spend the rest of what you've got trying to win against this complete bullet sponge, and it was easily one of the worst experiences that I've had in the series to date. That is, until you reach the final boss. Now admittedly, the final boss looks amazing, but again, there is just absolutely no thought put into the actual fight. When you go to fight this giant bug, prepare to spend eternity being stun locked. She releases these tiny bugs that respawn every couple of seconds, and they will just stun lock you into oblivion. They are so hilariously frustrating. And even if you are lucky enough to be able to hit them, by the time you've set your sights back on the main boss, they have already respawned and put you in hell again. And it is such a painful waste. These are just a couple of examples, but a lot of bosses follow this method. Now, we've talked about a couple of negatives, so let's move on to some of the things that I actually liked about this game. Firstly, the look. Resident Evil has never looked better. Thanks to the new hardware, they were able to really pull out all of the stops on the environment and the models, and this game looks fantastic. The music also works well, and I noticed it a lot more in this title than I did in the previous trilogy. And again, it absolutely is a feather in the cap for the game. It's really, really good. But yep, that's about it. Next, the story and villain. Now, folks, I don't think I can actually sum up the story to this game. I found it unbelievably confusing, to the point that after I played and finished this title, I watched one of those story explain videos and still didn't understand what the hell was going on. The main villain of this game is Alexia Ashford, but you'll also have to deal with her brother Alfred quite a bit, who likes to dress up and cosplay his sister, and the game revolves around a new strain of the T-virus called the T-Veronica. And with the way that this game's paced and framed, I just didn't understand any of their motives. But it's not all bad news, as Wesker shows his face for a couple of scenes as well, mainly with Chris, who is also a playable character here, as in the second half of the game you will play as him as he goes in searching for Claire himself. Now, straight away, Wesker is the absolute highlight of this title. If he's in a scene, it'll be one of the best in the game, and this gives some fantastic lore between the Wesker and Chris dynamic. I personally think Capcom just bit off a little bit more than they could chew, and if it was a touch more refined, we could have had a much better and easier to understand story. Now, honestly, this could be a complete me issue, so I'm willing to take that on the chin. But from the reaction of my Twitch chat who are watching this alongside me playing it, I definitely feel like it's more confusing than it needs to be. On top of that, I also think Code Veronica is easily one of the hardest games out of the mainline entries. There are large amounts of enemies that you will constantly have to fight, but ammo and health feels really rare to come across. Now, that's not a problem to some, as this is a survival horror, but at times it just felt really unfair and a little bit stingy. But not only that, Code Veronica is also the title that you can soft lock yourself the easiest in. The plane fight with the Tyrant is a prime example, and this happens several times throughout the story where you're given an extremely unwinnable situation, and if you didn't stockpile ahead of time for that, chances are you'll be loading an old save, or even worse, starting the entire game again. So I feel like the balancing is also really out of whack as well. Now, I've said a lot of negatives about this title, but honestly, it's not the worst game. It's not my favourite, and I will say that it is definitely one of the weakest mainline entries, but the game is not unplayable. In fact, a lot of times can be fun, but to me, most of the components that make this game are weaker than the trilogy that came before it. The cutscenes and the voice acting are somehow worse than the PS1 era, the enemies are underwhelming, the bosses are appalling, the characters just don't feel right, and the story is weak as hell. A lot of people are begging for a remake or a reimagining of this game, and I am actually one of the people on that list as well. I feel like this game deserves to be given another go, and a remake could perfectly sort out all of the issues that I faced when playing it, and it could end up to be a phenomenal title. But unfortunately, the game I've just played isn't one that I'm going to go out of my way to recommend. If you enjoyed this game or think that this is the best that Resident Evil has to offer, I mean no offense, and I'm actually really glad you enjoyed it in a way that I couldn't. But for me, it was just far too ambitious, and from that, it misses the mark on most of the components involved, which is just a real shame. So folks, for me, Code Veronica is going to be going straight above Survivor. Now, it's a lot better than Survivor, because most games are. However, I was expecting a lot more from this game, and I wasn't expecting to get as frustrated as I did with it. And I'd play the original trilogy over this one any day, so please don't hate me. But don't worry folks, it's time to move on already. And honestly, I don't know what to think going going into this one, as the next title takes Survivor and Code Veronica and just smushes them both together for a sequel I don't think anybody saw coming. Oh god damn it, Steve is back. So this time around the year is 2001, and Capcom decided to give the gun shooter another chance at life. This time, however, the events of this game mimic Code Veronica to its entirety. So once again, let's give it a fair shot and see if Code Veronica is much better as a more mindless gun shooter. Now the basic premise of the main game is simple. As either Claire or Steve, you must explore the locations of Code Veronica looking for a key. Once you find it, head to the exit and that's the level over. You'll of course have to deal with swarms of zombies and creatures in your path and take out the end of level boss of course, but fundamentally that is it. Now gameplay wise, as I just said, you can pick from either Claire or Steve, and each have a couple of different weapons to their arsenal. For example, Steve have the Akimbo Gold Lugers that he absolutely loves, and Claire has a personality that doesn't mimic 40 grit sandpaper, so of course we go with Claire. With your choice you're then thrown straight into the action. You have guns and zombies, best introduce them together. The pistol, like in the last game, has unlimited ammo, but the other more rare weapons do only come with a mag or two. But I shouldn't actually say rare considering they are quite common to pick up. For example, in the very first mission, the first gun that I found was in fact the Magnum, which was quick to say the least. But all of the weapons you'd expect to find here return as well. For what it's worth, the movement and the gunplay of Survivor 2 definitely feel like a small improvement over what came before, once you get used to the absolutely bizarre control setup that is. Once you do, it's still not perfect, but it's definitely an upgrade, which made barreling through the levels quite easy to be honest. So easy in fact that we reached the first boss in the first level within a matter of minutes. Now I would love to say that this was a nice challenge, but unfortunately we dispose of the spider within seconds thanks to the Magnum that I mentioned before. And this can also be said about most of the bosses in the game. Since you know where the boss room is on every single map, you can literally just go find god weapons and head straight there, making the bosses feel just like another NPC really, which isn't ideal in my eyes. Not only that, but unlike Survivor 1, we are not alone. Since we are playing as Claire, Steve also is here and helps you every step along the way, which definitely felt decent to have another gun next to me, but again it also decreases the difficulty as it doesn't take that long to put many of the enemies down in the game. And not only that, since there's an extra gun on the field, they can be used as a distraction, which means that you can sometimes get the boss to half health before they even swing their first attack at you. But that's not all. I'm sure you folks have seen the Nemesis timer at the top, and this is literal, as when that timer depletes, Nemesis is then unleashed on the map, and this dude is 100% invincible. You cannot kill him. If you try, the game itself says, "Stop doing that, you idiot," and run. And this to me is a good and a bad thing. Firstly, the inclusion of Nemesis to speed up the game fits quite nicely, and it made a fun exchange of, oh, I could search this room for more herbs and bullets, but if I do, Nemesis will hunt me down. It adds a tiny amount of risk and reward. To be honest, it would add more, but as I said, it's quite easy to clear the rooms in no time, so by the time Nemesis actually comes out to play, you're probably fully stocked and on your way to the boss anyway. But I do think there are a couple of negatives with Nemesis's inclusion. Firstly, you can't kill him. I absolutely hated that. Nemesis is literally the tyrant that people want to try to kill the most. Thanks to Resident Evil 3, we know that killing him should provide some incredible upgrades and bonuses. So it felt really weird here that Nemesis couldn't be taken on as part of an extra challenge during the levels if the player felt like it. I also don't understand why Nemesis is here at all. I'm probably overthinking it, but just adding Nemesis feels a bit weird considering that Nemesis's main purpose was to hunt down STARS operatives and stop them from leaking Umbrella as the reason behind the Raccoon City outbreak. So what the hell is he doing here hunting down two teenagers? No idea. As I said, I'm probably overreading into it, but I feel like designing a new and terrifying tyrant or an enemy would have made much more sense. Now, in regards to story and cutscenes, there really isn't a story, as the main mode in this game is arcade mode, where you have to flow through 5 stages and that's it really. The game mirrors the events of Code Veronica, as with every level you go deeper into the locations, but they just seem to use Code Veronica as a base for the easiest asset pull of all, and that's all that's really on offer here. But cutscenes, however, I'm pleased to say that they actually look great. They're not one for one the same as Code Veronica, but they do still play out the same way in the long run. There is only one thing to note here, that there is absolutely no voice acting in this game at all, and this really threw me. Subtitles appear on screen, but that's it, and honestly, sometimes they're wrong. Absolutely no voice acting though, and while that's a great thing in one aspect because it means that Steve is lovely and quiet, it does feel odd to see characters interact without saying a word, and I think this is the first time of that in the series. Even the previous Survivor had dialogue, so it's odd for it not to be included here, considering that all they'd have to do to use the audio was to pull it straight from Code Veronica. It's also worth noting that this game doesn't look great. There is just far too much visual information on the screen at the same time, and at points it genuinely hurt my poor simple brain. Now I'm not going to ask for too much because obviously UI design back when these games were released wasn't the biggest focal point, and every single one is a little bit weird. But this one just felt like they held nothing back and just threw everything they could at the screen, and it's really noticeable. And don't worry, even though that it isn't anything great, there are so many more game types for you to play, like the absolutely iconic versus roach mode, where you, have to shoot a bunch of roaches on the wall. It's nothing more than an aim trainer where you can't actually aim your weapon, so you just have to stare at the wall until the roach in question happens to walk into the place that you need them to. Christ, what is this shit? Yeah, folks, it's safe to say that this game is really weird. There are a couple of improvements, I guess, but on the whole, I really don't understand why they decided to give it a go like this. The gameplay gets repetitive after 20 minutes, the game is quite easy, which makes it even more boring, and gets more boring the further you go into it. And there's also no objective, no reward for playing, and again, it just feels really lazily put together. Folks, this is a terrible game. There is genuinely zero reason to play this title. All it does is offer a much worse Code Veronica experience that gets boring after the first level. There's no incentive to play, and yeah, this game absolutely confused the hell out of me. There is no beating about the bush, folks. This is easily one of the worst games I have ever played, Resident Evil or not. And not only would I say you're missing nothing from playing this, I would actively say do not play this. It is a complete waste of time. So, straight to the bottom of the list it goes. So, the past few games haven't been great, admittedly, but thankfully, folks, that is all behind us, as now the next game is guaranteed to be better than this. Oh, what are we playing next, actually, by the way? Oh, dear God, no, please. Shit. So yes, we arrive at Resident Evil Gaiden, a fun new take on the series made exclusively for the Game Boy Color. So can the first ever handheld Resident Evil experience deliver something great? In one word, no. But in two words, still no. But let's crack it open anyway and see what it's about. Firstly, and most unavoidably, is the music for the game. Now, I'm sure they tried, but Jesus wept, the moment the music kicks in, you can literally feel your ears bleed under the pain. Like, I pretty much had to play this game with audio on like 5% because any more than that and it would physically hurt. So we're not off to the best start. What's the game about, I hear you ask? Well, in this thrilling new title, we play as none other than Barry Burton. God, it hurts that this is the next time we play as this dude, but in this, yes, we are Barry Burton. And we've been sent on a boat in search for Leon Kennedy, who himself is trying to find a new rumoured bioweapon somewhere on the ship. So that's essentially the premise, so let's hop into the gameplay. It's clear for a handheld console that compromises would have to be made, as the hardware just cannot handle anything like the Resident Evils that they've put out before. But besides the look of the game, does it actually handle anything close to a Resident Evil game? Well, surprisingly, kind of. The basic gameplay loop actually feels very similar to what came before. You're on a pretty sizable ship, and to progress you must explore every nook and cranny you can for key items, ammo and health to then use in the fights. Unfortunately, I can't say that puzzles are really here, as most of the time a puzzle consists of finding a specific key to a specific door, so it is what it is. Now this is all quite surface level stuff, to be honest, but it's still nice to see that there's remnants of a Resident Evil in here. But unfortunately, when you start to poke a little deeper, that's where the issues really come out to play. And firstly, I've got to talk about the combat. Since you're not able to open fire on zombies like you do in the previous game, here you are entered into scripted QuickTime events. These took me so long to understand, as the game does a very bad job of telling you what to do here. But after you get used to it and learn what stuff is, I suppose it's okay. Decent for the console and the hardware limitations, but I can't say it's either that fun or engaging. Now, this wouldn't be a problem, as a staple for Resident Evil is of course the option to not engage in fights to conserve ammo, but unfortunately you can't do that in this game, as key items are tied to zombies that you need to kill them for them to drop. This kinda works against the premise of the game, as ammo and health are not common, so having to force yourself into fight after fight just to try and get a single key that you really need got really old, and definitely makes this harder than it appears on the surface. Now folks, this game is a really weird situation. Unlike Gun Survivor 2, you can tell that the devs really put a lot of effort into this game, and you can tell that they tried to give the player the most authentic handheld survival horror experience that they could. And for what it's worth, it's somewhat close. It definitely has remnants of Resident Evil here, and you can feel it slightly, but it's not enough to get over the flaws that get in the way of the fun. I'm again not going to beat around the bush. I put an hour into this and that was enough for me. It lost its charm very quickly, but I'm still not fully mad at this for existing, and in many ways it deserves to exist a lot more than some other Resident Evil titles do. Now, I'm not going to be coming back to this game anytime soon, I think that's fairly obvious, but I do need to give it some credit. The story is somewhat decent, the gameplay is fun for the first half an hour, they adapted combat as best as they could, and I think that's worth praise. That's why personally, I wouldn't say that this is the worst Resident Evil out there. Gun Survivor is too, because it screams of laziness and offers absolutely nothing, whereas the devs clearly tried with this game, but I'm only going to be putting it above Gun Survivor 2 because, yeah, it's nothing better than that. Yeah, it's not the best, but it's not officially the worst, at least to me anyway. But folks, we've waded through some of the weaker Resident Evil entries, but now it's time to return to form, and it's also time for our first remake. And this is actually one of the few Resident Evils that I've still yet to play, and I could not wait to see what all of the fuss was about. It's time to go back to the start one more time. Oh boy folks, I've heard a lot about this one. My Twitch chat told me plain and simple that this is one of, if not the greatest Resident Evil game out there. But I'll be the judge of that. How great can it be? It's just a remake of the first game. Well, let's see. So as I mentioned, this time we're going to be going through the story as Chris, and whilst a lot of the story beats still ring similar, there are some tweaks, such as the encounter with Wesker at the end of the game, the fact that Barry's nowhere to be seen, and now Jill is the one who is missing. But for the most part, the game plays quite the same as the first one, just with a couple of different characters and minor tweaks. That is not the only change though, as the remake also brought a collection of changes to the layout, including brand new locations such as the cemetery, Lisa Trevor's house, and many other locations throughout the title. This makes it so that anybody who knows the original game won't just be able to glide through it with no thought, and considering it's only been a couple of weeks since I've played the original, I was already very happy with this realization. To be honest though folks, the gameplay, the combat, and the mechanics all pretty much work identically to the original title. Tank controls are in full display here, even though now you can walk up and down stairs freely. The combat works the exact same as we've seen before, and we still deal with 90% of the puzzles, backtracking, and inventory management that made the first game work as well as it did. But of course here the graphics also look incredible and are definitely an improvement. Truth being told folks, I wasn't expecting to be playing this game already. I honestly thought this remake came out a lot later than it did, because the graphics are really impressive, and as a reminder, this game came out in 2002, the same year as Super Mario Sunshine, Vice City, and my favourite horror game of all time with Eternal Darkness. But the remake of Resident Evil looks extraordinarily good for its age. It's not just the graphics though that have seen a significant improvement, as cutscenes and voice acting have also had a lot of updates and feel a lot more realistic than the 90s cheese that we're used to, which in itself also adds a lot more life to the title as well, even though some of the most iconic lines in this series have been changed. Easily, however, the biggest changes, as I said, are the locations, and there are new sections altogether, and easily the best section to demonstrate this would be the terrifying moments where the sharks are introduced. In the original, it was a small room with knee-high water and a couple of weird purple sharks that chased you around. Here, however, in the remake, this entire section has been completely changed to something truly terrifying, as now it's not just a couple of small sharks chasing after you, it's an entire fish tank filled with ginormous Neptune sharks that can really mess you up. And if you folks know me, you know that water and water-based creatures creatures are literally the worst for me. So this section felt like an absolutely insane improvement. It is easily the scariest part of the game, and if that wasn't enough, there's also an entirely new boss fight here with Mother Neptune. Now, it's more of a puzzle fight than an actual combat fight, but it's just another additions that the devs didn't need to do. They did though, and I love them for that. It really shows how much love that they poured into this remake, and it happens throughout the entire game. But I think we need to talk about the biggest point of weakness in the original game again. In the original, the big bosses of the game were some of the easiest fights in the entire series, so this was the aspect of the remake that I was looking forward to the most. And folks, I'm really glad to say that the bosses in the remake are not pushovers in the slightest. Take Plant 42. We killed it in the original before it even had a chance to attack, and my god, that is not the case here. The fight is a genuine joy, and it is a tough one to say the least. And thankfully, every single boss has had this treatment. You are no longer able to get rid of them without thinking. You need to prep well, understand your environment, and try your hardest to get the edge over these gigantic opponents. And this to me is perfect. It's the exact right amount of difficulty to me, and because of this, every fight felt so much grander than the original and much more memorable. Yawn, the spiders, and even a new fight with Lisa Trevor. Each one has a unique angle that forces the player to really adapt to survive, and I honestly cannot sing the praises enough. Finally, the boss fights here are worth talking about. To be honest folks, I actually don't think there's that much to discuss here without just mentioning a ton of tiny details or repeating things that I said in the base game. It truly is a very faithful remake, so that means there's less to discuss here in the grand scheme of things. To me, literally every single component of this game is not only a considerable improvement on what came before, but they've been able to do this while still keeping the original feel of the game. There is, however, a single negative point that I would like to mention, but I can't say that it's specifically tied to this game, because I imagine it's the same as the original, as it is tied to playing as Chris. As I said, there are slight differences between the two main characters. Jill can't get as many critical shots off and has a lower health pool, but she can carry 2 more items in her inventory, whereas Chris has a regular amount of 6 item slots, but has more health and such. And playing as Chris for the first time, I noticed that 6 item slots feel really low and constricting to the player. The only thing that I would complain about throughout the entire playthrough was the additional backtracking that I had to do because of the limited inventory, and because the remake adds more puzzles and areas that also increase the amount of things that you need to carry. And for a lot of the time, 6 inventory slots just felt too low for the amount of content in this game. Considering that you need to carry puzzle pieces, herbs, guns and bullets, it was a constant fight to make sure that I had only on me what I needed, and in some parts where the balance wasn't right, I would struggle quite a bit. For this remake, I would have liked to have seen a small increase in inventory slots, just to streamline the new additions a little bit easier, whilst having resource management still be a crucial part of the gameplay loop. I don't want 30 because that would defeat the purpose, but I think naturally having 8 would have been a step in the right direction. But I will admit that this is a small complaint, but one that I still feel worthy of mentioning. Folks, this one has been fairly short and sweet, but to me, the remake of Resident Evil is easily one of the greatest of its kind. It was so unbelievably faithful to the original that I can totally understand people when they say that not only is this the greatest Resident Evil remake in history, but potentially the greatest remake of any game ever. It truly captures exactly what a remake should be, and that's giving the great game before a brand new fresh coat of paint, a few tweaks and quality of life improvements, and ironing out the problems of the first title. And my god, this game does that better than you could possibly believe. If you've avoided the original because you're scared of tank controls and playing such an old horror game, as I do know that that's not everybody's cup of tea, I will say that playing this remake would still be a phenomenal place to start. It is fantastic what they did here, and again, I have to mention this was made in 2002, 23 years ago. So I think this comes as a surprise to absolutely nobody when I put the Resident Evil remake right at the top of the list. This is a phenomenal experience. It has had so much love poured into it, it irons out pretty much every kink that the original had. So, right to the top of the list it goes, we have a new reigning champ. So folks, we're back in the good books. Capcom have done it again. Resident Evil Remake was an absolute joy. But don't worry, we wouldn't be waiting much longer for the next title, as it was released the very same year. The next game, however, would again really push the boat out and give us a brand new type of Resident Evil. And not only that, we're going back to the beginning of everything, and I truly mean the beginning. We are as far back in the timeline as we can go now, folks. Resident Evil 0 is a prequel to the original that takes place the day before the events of the first game. As I previously said, this is also a very ambitious title, which takes the formula we know and love and shakes it quite a little bit. So let's waste no time and see what 0 has in store for us. We of course must begin with the story. We start on a train and things seem very nice and fine to begin with, but a rock choir and a swarm of leeches immediately turn this lovely train journey into a nightmare. We then cut to the new main character, Rebecca Chambers, as she is part of the Bravo team that went missing in the first game. Things go wrong as they always do, and we eventually make our way to the leech train. Here we find an escaped convict, Billy, and are forced to team up to survive the onslaught of danger. It goes a lot more deep than that, but of course, that is the premise. Let's begin by discussing the biggest change to the game, and that is the new partner system. Unlike any of the Resident Evils that came before, for 99% of the game, the two main characters will explore every location together, and at a push of a button you can freely swap between either Rebecca or Billy. This on the surface works really well, and to begin with I enjoyed this change quite a lot, but to implement this new change they did add a couple of more mechanics, and some work and some really don't in my opinion. Firstly, there is no item box in the game. The idea is that with two combined inventories you can pass key items, guns and everything you'd expect between the two characters, and even though this may work on the surface, in the actual game it can get quite stressful and definitely ramps up the difficulty, as if you find something that you need but can't carry it, you have to drop items on the floor and come back to get them later. This to me often resulted in leaving ginormous piles of ammo, guns and herbs at save points to collect later on, and whilst this may not be that big of an issue on the surface, when you go to change locations that means you'll have to spend so much time manually transferring all of this gear to a new save location, or just abandon it all and hope that the new area has enough items to make up for it. And for the most part, this gets in the way more than it works in my eyes. The item boxes should still be in this game, as this absolutely kills the pacing when you get past the initial train section. And because of this, it also increases the amount of backtracking that you'll need to do within this title, and at some points it does reach an egregious level. Considering that the locations aren't exactly the smallest, if you've left one thing in one particular room, you're not able to just go to an item box and get what you need, you have to track back to the exact square where that item is, which again could really knacker the pacing when you're halfway through a location and have to drop everything to go and find a single item and hope that you remember where you put it. So the new system does have a few good points, but for the most part it is slightly weaker than what came before. So let's move on to enemies, as this game introduces so many new kinds of foe to face, and honestly folks, the enemies in Resident Evil 0 are no joke. This game has the reputation of being one of, if not the hardest Resident Evil games in the entire collection, and it's easy to understand why. Zombies return in the way that you'd expect, but there are three primary new additions: these gigantic cricket creatures, the leechmen, and the unbearably irritating eliminator enemies, or as I like to call them, little bastard monkeys. Every single one of these creatures are complete bullet sponges, and they all pack an unbearable punch. Making the enemies harder does make sense, as now for the most part there are two characters fighting at the same time, but they feel no fun to fight at all, with me personally saying that the little bastard monkeys are the worst characters pretty much in the entire series. I hated them. They have an unbelievable amount of health and they attack you with the strength of a hunter. Not only that, they can stun lock the hell out of you while shredding your health to nothing. And if you're playing as Rebecca, that will not take long at all, as regular zombies can take her from full health to caution in a single bite, which got really annoying really quickly, which then compared to the lack of item boxes really can make you feel like slamming your head into a brick wall. But what are the bosses like? Well, for the most part, they're okay, I suppose. Definitely not the highlight of the series, but I can't say that they're terrible either. For the most part, you'll be fighting larger animals like in the first, so the train scorpion, the church bat, and the centipede as a couple of examples, but you still do have a tyrant fight and of course the queen leech fights. To me, they're appropriately difficult, but they also don't really stand out that much compared to the bosses that came before, so I'd say they're very middle of the road. But the fight with the centipede also shows another layer on how the partner system could have been implemented better. For context, when this fight arrives, you're playing as Rebecca, and as you pick up a key that you need, the centipede emerges and kidnaps Rebecca, carrying her throughout the fight, as you shoot the bug with Billy. The problem is that when I first encountered this fight, Rebecca had all of the good weapons, as since I didn't know that this fight was on the horizon, I didn't separate the guns at that point. This resulted in an easy forced loss, as since I couldn't swap to Rebecca and couldn't trade the weapons that I needed, as she was in the loving embrace of the bug, I had nothing to fight the centipede with, and it just felt really cheap and anticlimactic. But yeah, the bosses themselves aren't bad in any way, but they do feel a little lackluster compared to what came before. But I suppose for this it will just depend on the player and their personal preferences when it comes to the big fights of these games. For me, it was very average throughout. So let's move on to the story, and again I'm sorry to say folks that the story feels very similar to Code Veronica, in that it tries too much and messes with the Resident Evil formula a little bit more than I'd care for. Swarms of leeches can perfectly recreate an elderly bloke, wrinkles and creases in the suit at will, and can even de-age him when they fancy it, which was really odd. Not to mention that he controls them with a choir singing. It's not the worst, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that it was really weird, even in a universe where tyrants feel totally normal and accepted. And to me, the big antagonist, the big boss of the game, just is not memorable in the slightest, and is easily one of the weakest entries in the RE series yet. The story can also get quite convoluted, but the premise is the same that what came before. Work together to survive and try to stop the bad things from happening. You've heard it before. But the only other problem with this story is that it kinda messes up Rebecca's character to me in the first game. At a section in the Resident Evil remake, Chris can save Rebecca from a hunter, and in this cutscene she is terrified and doesn't know what to do. But that scene now makes no sense, as just the day before, Rebecca was taking out hunters and tyrants without a second thought all on her own, and it just makes the continuity a touch messier than it needs to be. But I guess it can't be helped if you're going to include Rebecca in the story, and it's not the end of the world, just something worth mentioning. Now, the last negative that I'll mention for now is that healing herbs are also really rare in this game, and it again just piles on how much harder it is. But I went entire sections without finding a single herb, and considering that you're now responsible for 2 health bars at the same time, this resulted in me reloading entire sections once I'd take a certain amount of damage, and again it just feels weaker than what we had before. Now folks, you may think that I hate this game from the way that I'm talking about it, and honestly, I really don't. The train sections in the beginning is easily the highlight of the entire title to me, and all of the new systems were really well implemented here. But once you get to the mansion and onwards, that's when you can really feel the true impact these mechanics have on the overall experience. But yeah, I enjoyed the game. It's easily the hardest to date, no questions asked, but it is still fun to play. It just gets in its own way a little bit too much to say that it's the greatest game. It's okay, it's not the best, but it's also not the worst either. Let's end by mentioning a couple more positives. Firstly, the look. The game is beautiful through and through. Capcom really knew how to squeeze the most out of this engine, as the level of detail is phenomenal. It looks fantastic, no questions asked. And the music as well. I really enjoyed it. It's perfectly tense and fits the theme of the game wonderfully. I certainly enjoyed the music here more than most of the games I've covered, so of course that needs to be mentioned as well. And lastly, the partnership between Rebecca and Billy. I really enjoyed both of these characters, and they serve the story really well. The cutscenes are good, and the dynamic between these two and how it changes over the course of the game is handled brilliantly in my opinion. So again, another strong point of praise there. To me, Resident Evil 0 gets a lot of praise and credit for once again trying to mix up the pre-established formula. And yes, even though quite a bit of it doesn't land, I'd rather have something like this that tries something new than just a copy and paste of what came before. Don't get me wrong, this game has a lot of weak components. So if you've not played Resident Evil before, this certainly isn't the one to begin with, as it won't leave the best impression. The story's kind of wild and confusing, the enemies are bullet sponges, and the inventory system isn't handled the best. It's also definitely apparent that this game is starting to steer the feel of Resident Evil to be a touch more actiony than just your generic survival horror experience, and to me that makes sense as a natural progression. But even with all of that, it still isn't a bad game. It definitely has its strong suits like the train section to begin with, which I thought was impeccable, but after you reach the mansion, the quality definitely takes a nosedive in my eyes, meaning that I'm not going to be rushing back to play this game anytime soon. So personally, I'm going to be putting Resident Evil 0 just above Code Veronica, as again, I'd play any of the other ones above it first, but I don't think this is the worst time a player can have in the Resident Evil franchise. With that, it would be many years until we see the next true sequel to the mainline entries, as a deal with Nintendo meant that they couldn't. However, don't worry folks, we've got a couple more side stories to tell first, and the next is yet again another attempt at a first-person shooter, and it's really interesting to be honest. Well, they've done it again. For the fourth time, Capcom decided that a light gun shooter was the way forward, a big risk considering what came before. Now, I don't know whether to respect their dedication to the genre of game or offended that they don't know when to call it quits. But let's see if fourth time's the charm, right? The story begins 4 years after the events of Resident Evil 2, and an Umbrella ocean liner called Spencer Rain has been infested with the T-virus. We play as the phenomenally named Bruce McGivern as he goes to this boat to shut down Umbrella and stop the man responsible for the outbreak, Morpheus Duvall. God, the names in this game are absolutely wild. So with that, let's see how this game sets itself apart from the Survivor titles that came before. The first thing that you'll probably notice is this game is the perfect blend of third-person exploration with first-person shooting mechanics, and I was already curious to see this in action. Now, truth being told, the controls are really tricky yet again. No idea why these games all have horrendous control setups. But to clarify, I only mean the shooting here. The exploration works as fine as it ever has, as it mirrors the previous entry as well. But for the shooting, it's incredibly tricky to pull off the shots thanks to the sensitivity being really crazy. It does take a bit of getting used to, but eventually you should be able to manage just fine. With first impressions, I was actually really pleasantly surprised with what was on offer here. The atmosphere for Dead Aim is actually really good. Every location has a dark, depressing, and almost lonely feel to it. Very little areas in this game are brightly lit, meaning that your flashlight is going to be the main source of light, which always adds another layer of horror into these in my opinion. The music as well is also really good, when you hear some that is. Now to me, music in a horror game is so crucial, and sometimes the lack of it actually adds more to the experience, like the monster title Alien Isolation. And I'd say that's exactly what's at play here. For the most part, the only sounds you'll hear as you explore the ship are the waves crashing against the hull, the sounds of your footprints as you move through, and the distant groans of zombies waiting to be murdered by yours truly. It's honestly really well done, except for one particular boss that definitely over-eggs the pudding, but it is what it is. But speaking of enemies and bosses, let's discuss the foes that you'll encounter on your stay at the Spencer Rain. And of course, the main enemy that you'll be smiting down are zombies, and here they work fine. The zombies here move at a decent speed and are reasonable threats since they spawn in large crowds. Each room will be full of them, and honestly there is nothing more satisfying than getting a critical bonce shot and watching them ragdoll to the other side of the room. It felt very nice when you get those shots in, and good ragdoll physics are always a fantastic appeal to a game. Other than the zombies, you'll face some familiar enemies of course with the hunters and the tyrants, but also a couple of brand new creations. I would say all of them are fun to face, but each foe you have to attack in the exact same way. Just point and shoot and dodge when you get too close. Oh, and the dodge in this game is extremely generous, and if you use this properly it can make some parts of the game really trivial. But the bosses are pretty much the same. They are decent enough to fight, but the weird controls can definitely make these parts harder than they need to be. And I will say that their looks aren't really the best. Besides the tyrant, they all just kind of look like big piles of skin, and it's okay, but they don't really stand out, so make of that what you will. With the story as well, yeah, it's really weird. Firstly, the main character and the side character that you bump into several times are such a blatant rip-off of Leon and Ada, and it's impossible to ignore. Also, another thing that's impossible to ignore are the cutscenes and how goddamn goofy Bruce McGivern is. He is a dork, and this is such a weird thing to mention, but to me, his voice doesn't match his look in any way, shape or form, which always made his cutscenes feel really odd.
Wait, you saved me earlier. You're Chinese security bureau, huh? Looks like we're in the same business.
Fonling is the Ada ripoff, and yeah, there isn't actually anything to her character. She is on the boat for the exact same reason Bruce is, but for some reason she constantly throws him off and messes with him, even though they both want the exact same thing. It's really odd, but I guess these games don't really put the stories first, which is fair enough, I guess. Folks, this game is another short one. From start to finish, it only took me an hour and a half to complete. So again, this is a really short dose of horror that was over just as I was getting into it and getting used to the controls. It plays very similarly to previous games with the puzzles, the safe rooms and the inventory management, as now you don't have infinite pistol ammo, but you might as well with the amount of armories that the game throws at you. Honestly folks, that's pretty much it really. Now, out of the Gun Survivor titles, this is easily the best, but it's a low bar. With the same as the ones that came before, I'm not going to be returning to this title anytime soon, but if I did want a light gun shooter to play, chances are this would be the one that I go to, so make of that what you will. This game will not blow you away by any mention, but it's also not the worst 2 hours that you could spend. That is why I'm going to be putting Dead Aim just above Survivor, because if you wanted a light gun experience, I would say this is the best of the bunch. And it's the only one that I don't actively hate, so yeah, with that, let's move on. As expected, this game had a mediocre reaction, but that's not the only side game that they'll be releasing before their next mainline installment. But unlike the Survivor games, the next spin-offs are good? Once again folks, it's time to play an infamous Resident Evil title that I had not had the pleasure of playing before. Now straight off the bat, I need to say that Outbreak is a co-op title, and ideally you're meant to play with a friend or two. Unfortunately though, that isn't really feasible without installing a hell of a lot of mods. So for this review, I'm going to be playing it solo, but honestly folks, bear with me. That kind of works in the game's favour here too. Now in terms of the story, there actually isn't really one here. Over the course of the game, you'll instead be playing through 5 scenarios that span from the initial Raccoon City outbreak and go on to the last day of it, but they're not connected in the slightest, each one offering a very small campaign that stands on its own. And the first thing that needs to be mentioned are the wacky cast of characters that you are able to choose. The concept of Outbreak is that the people you play as are just regular citizens who were caught in a bad place at the worst time. No heavy plot armor main protagonist, this game is to see what the outbreak was like for your regular Joe. But you actually do get a decent list that you get to choose from, and it's actually quite impressive. I also need to mention the noise that the characters make when you pick them, as it is hilariously weird.
Yeah.
But every single character has their own unique ability that makes them stand out a little from the rest of the crowd. For example, Jim has the ability to just launch himself to the floor, which I found absolutely hilarious, but it turns out that this is so he can pretend to be a zombie and have a chance at the enemies ignoring him. But another example is Alyssa, who is also here as the new Master of Unlocking, and she seems to be quite important as her and her daughter are returning to Requiem, which I'm so excited about. Straight into the game though, we are shown the absolutely beautiful cinematic that shows the infection spread throughout Raccoon City to some stunning music. But with that, we are thrown straight into the deep end. As I previously said, this game takes place during 5 scenarios, and the first is the initial outbreak at the bar. So the main concept of this game is that you play as one of a few survivors that are all trying to escape the mayhem, and these other characters are with you as well. Not all of them, but some. But with that, go! Survive! That is all you are told. But the concept is very familiar to Resident Evil. You must find keys, guns, ammo that take you further into the level, but the best part is that every character acts independently. So as you are finding your way throughout the level, the NPCs are also exploring all there is, finding ammo and such, and this immediately felt fantastic to me. The idea of a bunch of people scurrying around to try and make the most out of a hellish scenario made it feel so much realer than more of the grander games that came before. Being able to enter a room with an NPC already killing zombies in there was a really nice touch. This also works in the grand scheme of things, as trying to get every character to survive is also important. You can share resources with any of the NPCs at any time, so I made it my personal mission to try and save all that I could. It didn't work out the greatest for us, but it is the trying that matters. And when you fail and a character dies, they will then be turned into a zombie that you need to take care of, which again adds a lovely little surprise on top, reminding you of the dangers and what happens if you fail. Now, honestly, gunplay works pretty similarly to what came before, from both a mechanic standpoint and the sorts of weapons that you'll gain throughout, as you make your way through the levels. But some of the more eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed in the bottom right a little infection counter, and this is a brand new type of mechanic. If that counter reaches 100%, guess what? You're dead. It constantly climbs naturally, but taking damage, lying on the floor, and any other dirty interactions will cause the gauge to grow faster, and I think it's a decent mechanic. It unfortunately does put a hidden time limit on all of your runs, but unless you're taking everything pixel by pixel, you will have plenty of time to explore before your timely death. This system is fine in my eyes, but honestly, it didn't really affect my gameplay that much, and for the most part, I'd actually forget that it was a feature, so whether or not it needs to be included is up for debate. I don't think it causes any harm, but it definitely doesn't add as much as you'd think it would. Now, story-wise, there really isn't a story here to be told, as I said, other than the desire to live and escape the city, and all of the dialogue and cutscenes reflect this. However, speaking of cutscenes, my god, this game has got some of the wildest dialogue and animations that we've seen in a Resident Evil yet.
Hey, Bob, where's your mind at?
What?
Huh? What a weird customer.
Hey, listen, you should go now. That's a fuel tank.
This isn't a bad thing. The cutscenes honestly were something that I would be greatly looking forward to, and they work perfectly for the game itself. So, what about the creatures you'll face throughout your time here? Well, it's also pretty much exactly what you'd expect. For the most part, and I mean 90% of the game, you'll be killing zombies. Zombies will be the main target of choice, and they are pretty tense and scary in this game. Looting in one area before hearing zombies as they break down the door and enter the room definitely gave me the odd panic or two. But other than those, you'll still be seeing the odd random foe on your journey like murderous crows or disgusting leech creatures, which all act differently. Like the leech monsters, for example. They can be distracted with blood pouches that you can spill on the floor, which I thought was a nice touch. The bosses in this game are also pretty good, but just act like a bigger NPC rather than a unique fight that you handle differently. Just pretty much shoot until dead, but that's perfect for this game, as it's about clueless survivors trying their hardest to win in an impossible situation, and it feels right. So, you may be thinking that just because I couldn't play this game co-op, I wouldn't be able to experience the true feeling of Outbreak, but honestly, I disagree. I think playing this solo unlocks a completely new mentality of playing. Personally, when I was going through, I was under the impression that I was responsible for the 3 characters that go through the levels together, meaning that equipping everyone with decent guns, herbs and tools was my highest priority, and the saying safety in numbers really rings home for this game, as when I was exploring solo, I was much more tense than I was when I had a survivor or 2 in the same room as me. It adds a layer of realism to the regular people just trying their best to survive, and that's what this entire game is about in my eyes. And with that vision in mind, this game works so well and is so much fun. I really was surprised on how much I was enjoying myself, considering that this can be quite a stripped back Resident Evil experience. The puzzles aren't too complicated, the levels are a lot more linear than before, and you have a couple more lifelines than you'd expect, but the fun is through the roof, it really is. Behind Code Veronica and Resident Evil 0, I would say that people have been asking for an Outbreak remake for quite some time, and after playing this, I would definitely say that I'm for that as well. Being able to see this game in a new light with all of the multiplayer components active again would be a joy, and I reckon a lot of people who have never played Outbreak before would really understand why this game is a fan favourite amongst the spin-offs. It certainly couldn't perform worse than the other multiplayer online titles, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Other than that, folks, there isn't really much more for me to talk about, but trust me when I say that I get the hype for Outbreak, and totally understand why it's got the reputation it has. It's a complete change of pace than what came before, and it offers short one-off stories that give the player the perfect excuse to lose themselves in the zombie apocalypse quite nicely. The mechanics all work quite well in my opinion, the look is fantastic, however I can't say that this is the scariest Resident Evil, so if that's your main measuring post on how good an RE game is, you might be a little underwhelmed. But honestly, besides that, it is a fine title that deserves the praise it gets, which is why I will be putting Outbreak just above Resident Evil 0. It might be brave to put such a wild spin-off over one of the mainline entries, but I loved this game through and through, and I would play it over Zero and Code Veronica any day, so make of that what you will. Now, the reception to Outbreak was slightly mixed. Some hated it and others loved it, but the reviews did well enough for Capcom to greenlight a sequel. Well, kind of. And they wasted no time in giving the next chapter to players, as only a year later, it arrived. So, when I say that a sequel was greenlit, it's actually a little bit simpler than that. Originally, Outbreak was meant to have a whopping 20 scenarios for the player to go through, and whilst the first game only had a quarter of that, they realised that they could still pick another 5 of those stages that didn't make the cut and give the players another dose of Outbreak, hence File 2. Now, to be honest folks, there actually isn't that much to talk about in this title, as they didn't really change that much going forward into the sequel. Some of the components were streamlined and certain bugs and such were fixed, but the base mechanics, the scenarios and the characters you play as mostly return the same, which to me is not a problem at all. So let's quickly discuss what is different. Firstly, the characters. Even though the same playable cast returns as they were in the first game, their individuality has been expanded quite a bit, thanks to the fact that each character now has new items and unique stats that make them stand out a little bit more, and give each a definitive playstyle that was definitely present in the last game, but here it's been developed a little bit further. There's also a new difficulty level with Nightmare Mode, which does exactly what you'd expect and gives veterans of the franchise a chance at a dangerous and deadly run. Now, other than quicker loading times and improved enemy AI, that's it really. You may think that that's a bad thing that a sequel has such little development compared to the last, but that's the wrong way to think about it for this game personally, as here it just gives another satisfying dose of joy that came before. Again, it's another situation of if it isn't broke, no need to fix it, and I'm thrilled to say that the new scenarios are honestly great here as well. However, to me, the absolute standout by far would be the Raccoon Zoo scenario, as if you don't think it's cool as hell to fight a mutated elephant as you work your way through the level, well, you might be a bit dense in the brain. We love Oscar, and Oscar is the best. The game feels and plays just as beautifully as it did before, and honestly, there isn't much to discuss. Outbreak File 2 is a lot of fun and a great continuation on what came before, so if you enjoyed the first, you're guaranteed to enjoy the second just as much, if not more. I personally enjoyed it more. The Raccoon City Zoo level alone is one of the greatest segments in any of these games, which is why I'm going to be putting File 2 just above the original, as because of that I do prefer it slightly. Thankfully, we again wouldn't have to be waiting long for the next game, and folks, it's finally time to talk about it. Some would say that the next mainline entry is the greatest Resident Evil ever created. I've played it many times, but it's been a couple of years since my last, so let's see what Capcom has in store for us next. Folks, we are here. But before we get into this properly, I do need to preface a little something. Firstly, there are an insane amount of ports and versions of Resident Evil 4. Skyrim is jealous of how many releases this game had. But I mentioned this as for the video, I'm only going to be covering the original and the remake, nothing else. And this includes VR, as there are a few VR versions of Resident Evil games, but I can't play them because they make me unbearably motion sick. So if you're wondering why they don't show up, that is why. It's also the same reason why we didn't cover Deadly Silence, as that's just a glorified port of the original with a few tweaks. So yeah, with that cleared up, let's move on. Folks, Resident Evil 4 is so infamous within the series that if someone was to only know a single Resident Evil game, chances are it would be this one. Once again, the formula was messed quite a bit with since Zero, so let's dive in and see if this game is still as good as people make it out to be. And spoiler alert, it is. The story this time time around once again revolves around our favourite rookie Leon S. Kennedy, although he is no longer a rookie. This gent has travelled to Spain on the president's orders to find his daughter that's gone missing. As you'd imagine, things start off reasonably fine, but quickly devolve into chaos, murder and infections. We have to find the daughter and hopefully get her home in one piece, whilst also taking down the cult responsible for her kidnapping. Hopping straight into the gameplay, the biggest change is obvious as hell. Everybody, say goodbye to tank controls. Resident Evil 4, we now have the standard third-person camera setup, and this was already such a wild change after playing all of the previous games. Other than the camera changes, for the most part, the controls actually feel quite similar to what came before. You still have to stand in place to shoot, which can be quite tense, as you have a whole village of the infected sprinting after you, but it helps just add that classic Resident Evil tension. You'll also notice that this time I said infected and not zombies, as the foes you'll face in Resident Evil 4 are technically not. The T-virus is nowhere to be seen. Instead, we have to deal with Las Plagas, which I'm really hoping I'm pronouncing correctly, but which loosely translates to the plague. And those inflicted with Las Plagas are a lot more complex than your basic mindless zombies, as here they appear fully human with a proper nice amount of brain function, but they are just essentially brainwashed by this parasite to do the bidding of the evil ones. That's why you'll see so many of the villagers use weapons like axes, chainsaws, dynamites and molotovs. To me, this is already a good improvement, as don't get me wrong, there is nothing wrong with zombies, but not knowing what sort of pain is coming next was always really fun. And the further you go throughout the game, the more equipped they become, and towards the finale they can actually be in full metal outfits with shields and rocket launchers, so they are much more capable a foe than the brainless rotters from the previous game. To be honest folks, for the gameplay loop, the mechanics and the puzzles though, they are honestly quite similar to the games that came before, just tweaked for this new location and era of Resident Evil. For example, inventory management is still very important, but in Resident Evil 4 you have a gigantic briefcase that is filled with slots, and every item you pick up must be perfectly fit into this box for you to carry. This itself is so fun in fact that it spawned a spin-off game entirely on its own. So let's talk about the new mechanics that make RE4 stand out by itself. Firstly, we need to discuss the new partner system, as eventually you will find Ashley, the president's daughter, and she will accompany you throughout the world as you try to get her home and protect her from everything trying to kidnap her again. And this system has been criticised by some as a gigantic escort mission, and whilst that is technically true, I don't think that's fair. Firstly, Ashley comes and goes at many points of the story, so you don't actually spend as long with her as you might imagine. And not only that, to me she adds a lot of tension to an already stressful situation. Take the bridge building part, where you have to protect her and yourself as she raises the bridge for you to carry on. This part is stressful in all of the right ways to me, and really highlights the dynamic at play. Not only that, but there are several ways to use this system to your advantage, as you can give a small amount of orders to Ashley, whether it being staying a little bit further back behind or hiding in a box. To be honest folks, I never really understood why people don't like the Ashley dynamic. I think it adds so much to the experience, and as I said, she isn't actually in the game as long as you'd think, but moving on. The next person that I need to talk about needs no introduction, but I'm gonna give him one anyway, and that is the Merchant. A new mechanic in this game is that throughout the story you will meet this lovely chap who buys and sells everything you need in the game. Weapons, herbs, upgrades, bombs, you name it. And thanks to the fact that you now earn money throughout the game, here is where you part with it all, and there is quite a lot of options. But the inclusion of this allows the player to customize their arsenal exactly as they see fit. Personally, I'm a sniper and shotgun fiend, so all of my money went into making those two lethal, and my god you can feel it when you play. But it's impossible to mention the Merchant and not talk about his iconic lines, as this chap is easily one of the most quoted Resident Evil characters of all time.
What are you buying? What are you selling?
Perfection.
Thank you.
So let's discuss the rest of the baddies that you'll fight throughout your stay here, as it's not just the infected humans. You'll deal with plenty of different creatures, from disgusting bugs, these blind gladiator bastards, parasite infected knights, just to name a few, and they are all really fun to engage with, and most must be dealt with in a particular way, which really mix up the gameplay. The bosses as well this time around, yeah, they're all just glorious, and there are quite a lot of them to go through. From the gigantic trolls, whose name I'm not going to butcher, Salazar the most cursed child thing that I've ever seen, the Big Cheese himself, old Major Krauser, and Sadler as just a couple of examples. And these fights are fantastic. Not only do they all look incredible and disgusting in just the right ways, but the fights themselves are so much fun. They can also take quite a bit of punishment, and I died at least once with every fight in this game until I understood how to tackle them properly. Well, that is unless you buy the rocket launcher. Now, truth being told, through the merchant you can buy rocket launchers, and honestly these are immensely broken, to the point that a single rocket can one-tap a boss. So I actually wouldn't recommend them, as it takes most of the fun out of the fights really. But for the most part the bosses are iconic throughout. However, there is something that I want to mention about Resident Evil 4 that may not seem super important now, but will make a lot more sense later in the series, and that's that Resident Evil 4 isn't really a horror game. Don't get me wrong, it has some good jump scares and moments, but this game is much goofier than I remember, and plays a lot more like an action game than the games that came before. Now, it's absolutely not a problem and works in the game's favour, but I wouldn't really call this a survival horror anymore, as you'll constantly have resources available to find or buy, and just the framing of the entire game leads more into action than it does horror. And this is shown very clearly by the fact that Leon is now a punching and melee maniac in this. Throughout the entire campaign you can stagger enemies and unleash deadly melee attacks on them that all feel fantastic to pull off and perform. Earlier I gave the basic premise of the game story-wise, and honestly there isn't that much more to add really. The entire purpose of the game is to escape with Ashley, but constant hurdles keep coming up that stop the player from doing that, namely Leon and Ashley getting infected with Las Plagas themselves. But the story to me is absolutely fine. Not the best of the series, but it's perfect for what they're going for. The cutscenes are also wacky and wild in the best way. They do a great job of making this a lot more cinematic than the games that came before. And yes, of course, the bizarre and iconic dialogue returns with some of the series' most well-known quotes.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
I've been expecting you, my brethren.
No thanks, bro.
So as I said back in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, I'm not going to really be talking about Mercenary mode, as they're in most of the games as side content. But Resident Evil 4 is also the first that adds some short stories to their extras as well, such as the Separate Ways story where you play as Ada, showing her involvement throughout the main campaign. So the side content for these games is also growing quite a bit, which is lovely to see, as more content in our favourite games is never a bad thing. Finally though folks, it's time to talk about the levels and aesthetic of the games, and you don't need me to confirm that this game looks amazingly stunning and all of the locations are fantastic through and through. I would definitely say that this Resident Evil shows you the most variety, from the initial village, the lake, Salazar's mansion, the factory island at the end. You truly won't expect where this journey will take you, but every single location is polished very nicely, so again, nothing but praise. The music as well, yeah, it's fantastic, we all knew that. Folks, there is very little to complain about here. It's easily the most polished journey throughout so far. The story is great, the cutscenes are cinematic and glorious, and I would also say this game does the best so far on making the characters of the story stand out. It really deserves the hype that it gets, and we all know this. But is it the best of the bunch? Honestly folks, it really shocked me to realise that no, I don't think it is. I still would play the remake of the one over this one if I had to choose. Don't get me wrong, this game is an absolute masterpiece, but I do think that I prefer the remake over it, even if it's just a little bit. Folks, I cannot stress how popular this game was. After some rocky years, it put Resident Evil right back into the spotlight, and the hype for this series was at an all-time high. But it would be 4 years before the next mainline entry. But we do have yet another spin-off that we need to discuss that only came a few years later. My lord, they just will not let shooter spin-offs die, will they? But at least we have a new type here as we arrive at the first rail shooter of the series. Released on the Wii and the PS3 initially, Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles aimed to give that classic arcade shooter experience from the comfort of your own home. So, let's see what's going on. In Umbrella Chronicles, you'll spend your entire time going through the countless RE stories of the past, but from a new first-person shooter experience. And honestly, straight off the bat, I really wasn't mad at this. It was clear clearly made with thought and love for the original games, as it pretty perfectly recreates the locations and story beats of those games quite well. It's also been many years since I've played a game like this, but only after 10 minutes I was enjoying myself quite a lot, and feeling a little bit nostalgic over this type of game. And as far as replicating the arcade experience at home, I think Umbrella Chronicles does a fairly decent job. The movement of the camera is handled really well in my opinion, and shooting is exactly what I'd want from this title, to the point that even if there was nothing on screen I would never stop, as so much of the environment is totally destructible, so windows, paintings, lights, chairs are all fair game, and by shooting them you can also find ammo, grenades, herbs, and even secret files. In terms of shooting the enemies that spawn, I must say it feels just as great. The controls are responsive and you can feel the shots as you blow another zombie's head off, so I was already having a lot more fun here than I was expecting. It's quite a faithful Resident Evil experience. Now something else that was a pleasant surprise was the boss fights, as yes of course they return as well, and again they have done a great job adapting them. The Scorpion was the first that we fought and I was surprised that it plays identically to the fight from RE0. The Scorpion tries to push you to the back, you have to duck its attacks and aim for the weak parts to push it back itself. And yeah, it's fun as hell, no questions asked. Don't get me wrong though, it isn't perfect. The one thing that bugged me a lot was the scripted moments where the game forces too much at you to handle, and there are many sections that just seem to force deaths or a lot of damage on the players, and these moments did feel quite cheap. But it again is a replication of the formula of the arcade machines, as they are meant to be difficult so that you die and part with more of your money. But here there isn't a money component, so these moments, even though they are kind of rare, when they happen they can be very irritating and a little bit unfair. Truth being told folks, however much fun I was having with this game, I can't say that I played it for that long. At the end of the day, it's just not the experience that I go to Resident Evil for. And not only that, after a couple of hours of playing, I did start to get a little bit motion sick. So I would recommend that if you do want to play this game, small bursts might be the better way forward than trying to tank it all in one go like I did. To summarise though, this is actually a pretty fun experience. It's very faithful to the games that it pulls from, and for the most part it nails the themes it goes for. So if you like rail shooters, then this game is an absolute must play. You will be impressed on how much love and thought went into this game, and there is a bunch of content here. For me personally, I'll be putting this behind Code Veronica, as it's still not a Resident Evil experience that I'm dying to play again, but a random hour here or there, yeah, why not? So that's where it's going. But with that folks, it's already time to talk about the next mainline entry, and this is where we start going into quite controversial territory. 4 years after the next was released, and fans made this game the best-selling Resident Evil pretty much instantly, but many were actually not happy with what they received. Resident Evil 5, the first true title of the Resident Evil series that caused a divide amongst fans. Some loved it and thought it was more than a worthy sequel, whilst others thought it was appalling and got everything wrong about what a Resident Evil game should be. And me personally, I think they're both right and both wrong. So, let's get into it. Set 5 years after the events of Resident Evil 4, we play once again as everybody's favourite bag of muscles, Chris Redfield. He is heading to Africa to team up with his new partner, Sheva Alomar, as they are tasked with stopping someone from selling bioorganic weapons on the black market. When we get there, of course, things quickly go to hell, and we must try to fix them. To begin with, I'd actually like to talk about what is similar to Resident Evil 4, as the combat and movement are pretty much identical. Same third-person angle from behind the shoulder, same combat choices when it comes to melee involvement and shooting, and speaking of shooting, weapons are now pickups once again, since there is no merchant in this game, but the choice of weaponry is exactly what you'd expect. Shotguns, pistols, ARs and grenade launchers, you know, the typical stuff. Again as well, puzzles do return, but admittedly they are rarer in this title than the ones that came before, as most doors, instead of needing a very convoluted reason to be unlocked, are now just a kick away from opening. So with that, let's talk about the changes, and the first is the fact that this is now a fully co-op experience, and Sheva, your partner, will be with you every second of the journey. Now you can of course still play this as a single player, but a co-op story was definitely the big focus of this title, and for the most part I think it's implemented quite well. It almost works similarly to Outbreak in that you have a limited amount of inventory spaces that need to be shared well, as the inventory management is another change for Resident Evil 5, and admittedly I think it is a bit of a downgrade. I preferred the system in 4, but the one here isn't the worst. But my point is that you can now share resources and, well, anything at this point with Sheva and vice versa. So working together with your partner is crucial to your success, as if you don't have an even distribution of herbs, ammos and guns, you or your partner will not last long, and you will have to constantly save them throughout, so good resource management is still very important here. We also can't beat around the bush. This is absolutely more of an action game than it is a horror. From the cutscenes and the scenarios that you end up, it is goofy from start to finish, but I wouldn't say it's at a ridiculous level of action just yet. And truth being told, the action fits really well into the game, from runaway lorries that need taking down, entire minigun sections where you have to kill bosses and bikes and such like that. And this is a really big focal point of people's complaints, that survival horror is missing. And whilst I totally understand that the horror aspect can be the biggest appeal for a game like this, I feel like calling this a bad game because it doesn't have as much horror in it really isn't fair. This is not a bad game at all. It is really fun from start to finish. Plenty to shoot, plenty to do, the mechanics work really well, and honestly in retrospective, it's not that much different from 4. They just leaned into it a little bit more, which was inevitable considering how well 4 sold. But you do fight the final boss in a gigantic active volcano, so I do get what people mean. But the DNA of this game is still extremely Resident Evil, from the convoluted story involving dramatic twists and parasites of all kinds, the characters you meet throughout and the enemies and bosses that you face. At its core, it is a Resident Evil through and through, but again, I do understand if this faster paced game isn't your cup of tea. It is, however, mine. I do love Resident Evil 5 and I can't pretend for a second that I don't. The biggest reason why to me is Wesker. I absolutely love when Wesker's involved in the story, and this is very much his game. He is the main villain and the story revolves around a new strain of virus called Ouroboros that Wesker wants to release to the world for, Wesker, what's it for?
Complete global saturation.
Ah yes, of course. For saturation. Now, the viruses in this game do get a little bit complicated, as the game begins with an evolved strain of Las Plagas, but then there's also Ouroboros and the progenitor virus as well. So yeah, I'm not going to be able to explain this one well, because frankly, I don't really know which bit's which. The point is, Wesker's back, and he's great. The enemies that you fight throughout the game as well are really awesome, from the generic zombie type to the bigger foes that you fight. And of course, the bosses. Most of them feel great to fight, and I don't think I had a bad time with any of them here. Admittedly, the bosses aren't the most memorable characters themselves, but the fights you will absolutely remember because they are just wild. But to clarify, there is a huge catalogue of enemies that you fight, both humanoid and not, and you truly don't know what to expect next as you'll work your way through the many chapters it has. Now, to talk more about the story and the cutscenes, folks, the dynamic between Chris and Sheva is actually one of my favourites so far, and honestly, I would love to see Sheva return again in a future Resident Evil. But there is a constant note that throughout the story there is a hooded figure doing all of the nasty stuff, and it is revealed to be a mind-controlled Jill. This to me was such a wild reveal and one of my favourite through the entire series. A possessed Jill that's working on Wesker against her will? I'm in! Now, not every story beat is the best, but this is without question one of my favourite stories so far, and I actually prefer this to 4 in many ways. The cutscenes again are also all well acted, full of the perfect cheesy dialogue that we've come to expect, and of course we need to mention the most famous action in this game, the boulder punching incident. There's no way that we wasn't going to bring it up, but my point is, folks, that the story the game tells is a really good one. But what about the locations that you fight and how the game looks? Well, again, yeah, I really enjoyed Africa as a setting. It's really weird to play a Resident Evil that's set in daylight, but it's a decent change of pace and it fits quite well. Again, the locations are brilliant this time around, but without question the starting village is the absolute standout. Nothing wrong with the rest, but the village just feels great. Now folks, there honestly isn't that much more to discuss, and if you play them back to back you will totally understand that Resident Evil 5 is not that much different from 4, and I think it is a fine game that is a lot of fun throughout. Don't get me wrong, it's better with a friend, no questions asked, but I would play this at any time. So if you were someone who wrote this game off as a terrible Resident Evil, I implore you to give it another go. As I said, I understand that it's not a horror game anymore, so just maybe pretend it's not a Resident Evil, as the game that we are given is still great. Now in the grand scheme of things, it is not going to be competing with any of the top slot games. However, I do think that I would play this over Outbreak, and I have a lot of fond memories of this game, so that's where it's going, and I Hope you understand. With that though, folks, it is time to move on. Now again, we'd have to wait a couple more years for the next true mainline release. However, we have some more spin-offs that we need to cover, and the next is yet another go at a rail shooter, for some reason. The Chronicles return, this time Darkside and not Umbrella. However, this game does two things. It is once again telling stories of the past that we know and love, but also tells us a brand new tale from Leon's perspective through the eyes of a first-person rail shooter. And folks, this one is going to be a very quick review. So from the initial standpoint, the game plays just the same as it did, except this one, as I just said, tells a new story throughout where we meet Krauser for the first time, and it sets up his and Leon's dynamic a little bit. Now, you may be questioning why this one's going to be a quick review. Surely I'd have tons to talk about. But unfortunately not, folks, as there is a big, glaring, gigantic problem. The camera. Within maybe 20 minutes of playtime, I had to shut this game off because it made me unbearably motion sick. Like, I cannot stress how appalling the camera works in this game. For some reason, they wanted to make it hyper-realistic, so the camera follows the character's head movement exactly how it happened in real life. Every single look, every single flinch, every single reaction, and it's appalling. This scene shows exactly what I mean the most. In this Resident Evil 2 section, we find a liquor, and this is the part where I was like, nope. Just for a bit of context as well, in this section, I do not have my hands on the controller. 100% of this movement is forced and scripted, and is absolutely awful. I have no idea what they were thinking, but that means that I know very little about this game, which means I can't talk about it. But even the parts that I can talk about are bizarrely weaker than the previous entry. Like, the models of the zombies that you fight are weirdly pixelated and don't look anywhere near as good as they did, in my opinion. And it is a bit of a shame because after the fact I did actually do some research on this game and it has some interesting components, but I can't talk about them because I couldn't play long enough to react to them without needing a nap and a sick bag. Now you may think that it's harsh, but yeah, that's all I can talk about here. To me, this game is unplayable and is a colossal waste of time. So yeah, without further ado, let's just put it on the list and move on. You are missing nothing by not playing this. The Darkside Chronicles is going to go behind Survivor, and honestly, I think I'm being generous. I'm sure it's got some great components and some praiseworthy stuff, but if your game makes me feel ill, nah, to the bottom it goes. Pathetic. So, moving on. For the next Resident Evil, we're going to give another shot to the developers of the first Survivor game, as they have apparently brought us a brand new handheld experience. Well, let's see if it's any good. Back in the Resident Evil 3 section, I said that I wouldn't be talking about Mercenaries as I was saving that talk for a future game. Well, surprisingly, Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D is that game. Releasing on the 3DS, it hoped to give players who are a fan of the mode an entire spin-off to keep them happy. So, let's see if it's any good. Now, truth being told straight away, I'm not the biggest fan of Mercenaries to begin with. There's nothing wrong with the type of game that it is, but mindlessly shooting zombies against a time limit has just never really done it for me outside, of course, of the Call of Duty zombies, which are just amazing. So, I wasn't expecting too much going into this game. That would be a mistake though, because this game seems to have a little bit more sauce than I was expecting it to. So, the premise is extraordinarily simple. Mercenaries 3D offers a range of missions from target practice to full-on zombie killing mayhem, and the idea is to complete whatever task the mission throws at you in the fastest time possible, with you getting a rank at the end and a certain amount of stars depending on your performance. The first few missions teach you the ropes, as the only thing you really have to deal with is just shooting barrels, but some of the future missions do get a little intense, as you're tasked with killing zombies with a small margin for error. Firstly, I would like to talk about the look, as it's pretty obvious that they use Resident Evil 5 as a base for the entire game, but have developed a bunch on top. So for most of the missions, you'll be in familiar locations that you've seen in 5, which isn't the biggest problem really for the game that it is. The next thing that surprised me was the incredible amount of characters that you can play as, with you unlocking more throughout your journey. Chris, Jill, Rebecca, Krauser, Claire, Hunk as just a couple of examples, and not only that, each character has different weapon kits and setups, meaning that you can really find either your favourite character or one whose playstyle that you really enjoy. I will say that personally, I think that Krauser is the best. He is an absolute damage demon in this game. But not only that, the customizable options for this game is also really impressive. As with the loadout, you can apply perks and bonuses of many kinds to your character to help give them that extra edge in the missions, and honestly, I wasn't expecting the customization to go this deep, but it was kinda lovely to see. Now, as far as the basic premise of the game, it's exactly what I've already explained, and dead simple, but there are the occasional bosses thrown in as well for good measure. So honestly, even though I said that I would be saving my discussions for this game, there honestly isn't that much to talk about in my eyes. This is a Resident Evil that you would play if you have nothing else to do and want to kill time for an hour, but if you're anything like me, the novelty of this title will wear out after the first 30 minutes. That's not to say that it's a bad game though. For what it is, I think it actually handles the setup really well, and if you've enjoyed Mercenaries throughout the Resident Evil so far, I think you'll have a good time here. But as I said, these types of games just aren't for me personally. You can tell that the devs really tried to do as much as they could with the premise, because the game looks great and is surprisingly polished for a title that released on the 3DS. The best thing about this title though, without question, is actually the music. The soundtrack and OST for this game is phenomenal, and it fits Resident Evil perfectly, to the point that whilst editing a lot of this video, I had the OST on quietly in the background. So if I could convince you lot to do anything in regards to this game, you've got to listen to the music. It is honestly great. So folks, yeah, there isn't really that much to talk about if I'm being honest. So without further ado, I will be putting Mercenaries 3D just above Survivor. I'm not going to be going back to it anytime soon, but for the game it's trying to be, I think it hits the nail on the head quite well. Alright everyone, with that we are moving on, but not moving on from the console, as the very next Resident Evil is a brand new single player experience built for the 3DS, and it seems quite impressive. Resident Evil Revelations originally released for the 3DS on January 26, 2012. However, this is not the version that we will be discussing for the video, as a short while later it was ported to PC and mainstream consoles, so we're going to be playing the Steam version as that's the one that I own. However, will it work at all, or is Revelations something that's better on the console that it was intended for? The story for Revelations is a wild one. After the events of Resident Evil 4, a bioterrorist organisation called Veltro launches a bioweapon attack on the city of Terra Grigia. A little while after that, Jill Valentine and Parker must investigate a ship that apparently has seen a resurgence of bioweapons near the ruins of Terra Grigia, and are sent to the abandoned ship the Queen Zenobia to find out what happened. To be honest folks, the concept of this one was definitely intriguing to me. Again, for those of you that don't know, open water is one of my biggest fears, so a Resident Evil set entirely on a ship was one that was guaranteed to be more scary than me than any of the other previous games. So let's see if that thought holds up. Firstly, the main thing we're talking about is that it is finally normal for characters to be able to move and shoot at the same time. It was very odd when this finally came around, but this simple change is so immediately noticeable for the better. Nothing wrong with standing in place while shooting for the previous titles, but yeah, it was time for the series to move on. Now, Revelations appears to be a fairly similar game to the ones that came before, but soon we are introduced to the first mechanic that really sets this game apart, and that is the scanner. Health items are no longer able to be picked up or created. For Revelations, if you want to heal yourself, you need to scan various monsters' corpses throughout the game, and when you scan enough to reach 100%, you'll be gifted some healing. An interesting concept for sure that I wasn't 100% on how I'd feel, but honestly, I didn't mind it in the long run at all. I can't say that I was ever in a moment where I didn't have enough health, so by just scanning often, which is something that you'll be incentivized to do anyway, you should always have a healing herb or two on you. So I personally think that this is a fine change that mixes up the formula a little bit. For Revelations, we also need to talk about the new virus at play here, as we are dealing with a new strain called the T-Abyss virus, and this one was specifically designed to see the effects of the T-virus on aquatic life, and through that, mutant and transformed marine stuff is what you'll mostly be fighting, as zombies technically again are not a part of this game, as the main creature you'll face are simply called the Ooze, and their design is pretty great to me. They look disgusting as anything, and they can be quite deadly if you're not paying attention. There are of course some returning creatures from moments in this game that take place on land, because god forbid a Resident Evil game exists without these bastards in it, but other special BOWs include the Sea Creeper, which are absolutely terrifying and deadly, the Gyozo, which are mutated fish and stuff along those lines. Honestly, I loved the enemies in Revelations. It felt like such a fresh change of pace, and I know I'm saying that a lot, but it really was nice to fight something that I'd never seen before, instead of it just being your generic zombie zombie, big bug, or tyrant. So to me, the enemies were great to fight through and through. Next, we need to discuss more of the story. Now, Jill and Parker coincidentally are also looking for Chris and his partner Jessica, as Chris's story in most games cannot just help the fact that he is missing, but they had the same mission as Jill and Parker and lost contact with the BSAA. This needs mentioning as for a decent chunk of the story, you actually play as different characters. Jill and Parker are the main, Chris and Jessica are secondary, and then there are these two absolutely terrible characters that I don't even want to remember the name of, that you play a couple of missions with as well. These two are pricks. Ignore them. It's going to be weird to say this is the next point of the game, but for some reason as well, Capcom really turned up the horniness on this one, and they weren't really subtle by it at all. Jessica is a very decent example of this, as for some reason her swimsuit didn't include both legs, and in one of the missions she says one of the greatest quotes in any Resident Evil ever.
Me and my sweet ass are on the way.
What? But it's not just her. One of the bosses that you'll fight early on and a couple of times throughout the story is Rachel. She is another character that was sent to the Zenobia, however her story ended with her death and mutation from the T-Abyss. And I mean, Capcom knew what they were doing here. That's all I'm going to say on the matter. Once again though folks, it is quite a complicated plot that Revelations tries to tell. It's not a bad one at all, but there are so many characters, so many betrayals, and so many moving pieces that it's kind of hard for me to talk about without just turning this into a plot explained video. So just know that I really enjoyed the campaign thoroughly, except for a single point that really got in the way of itself. This game cannot help but constantly fake out characters' deaths over and over again. It got really annoying towards the end of the game. For example, Parker. He is seemingly killed, and I am very sure on this, 4 times in the same game. One of the biggest scenes of Revelations is Parker making it back from death once, then 2 seconds later he gives his life so that he doesn't slow Jill down and get her killed, then it's revealed that he was saved from that yet again, even though we just watched him fall into a solid wall of fire. It was definitely too much and got really boring really quick. But other than that, no complaints. The last thing that I need to mention story-wise is that the pacing of the main campaign is also really odd. The story, as I said, is a little bit complicated to follow, but the game goes on a lot longer than you'd expect. When we was fighting the whale boss, the build-up to that fight was massive, and I thought I'd reached the end of the game. But in fact, there was another 3 hours left, and it was just really jarring. Not the biggest complaint, but one definitely still worth mentioning. With creatures in the story discussed, of course we need to talk about the bosses, and folks, I'm really glad to say that the bosses you'll face in Revelations kick ass. They are all terrifying and intimidating masses that really need your attention to be able to overcome. From colossal mutated whales, the ultimate T-Abyss tyrants, and so many other weird and disgusting creatures. It's impossible not to be revolted, impressed, and a little bit creeped out when fighting them. It's also nice to say that I think Revelations gets the balancing on them absolutely perfect. They are not bullet sponges, but they need thought to be able to take down, or you will die. I found it really well tuned in my opinion. It also gives me great joy to be able to say that my hunches were correct. This very much may be a me thing, but Revelations is easily the most scared I've been in a Resident Evil yet. The horror is fantastic in this game, and if you're the same as me and not a fan of the ocean or what lies beneath it, then I'm sure you'll come to the same conclusion that I have. So again, another great point of praise. But folks, that's pretty much it honestly. Revelations to me was a really pleasant surprise, and honestly it became one of the most memorable experiences I had in recent years. I genuinely loved this game, which is why I'm going to make the very controversial take of putting this above the original Resident Evil. It's the scariest Resident Evil that I've played so far. The enemies are great, the story gets a bit complicated, but the bosses are great, and it's just outright a brilliant time. But however much I loved Revelations, it's already time to move on, and the next release is yet another spin-off, and apparently it's meant to be the highest action take on the series yet. It's time for another infamous entry in the series, and for this one, it's all for the wrong reasons. Now again, this is a game that I didn't see or play a second of until it was time to make this video. So with a pinch of salt and the benefit of the doubt, I loaded it up, and yeah, everybody was totally correct. Operation Raccoon City tells a unique tale where you play as a group of Umbrella operatives, and your job is to clean up the mess that Umbrella left whilst also doing some other missions throughout, like stealing Birkin's G-Virus sample. On paper, it's a really neat concept that definitely seems intriguing, but the problems with the game are immediately noticeable the moment you take control. control being the key word. The controls, movement and combat for this game absolutely suck. They're stiff, awkward and totally unresponsive. Not only that, but it's clear that this game was, at least to me, just trying to be a Gears of War clone, as the combat and movement is damn near identical with a big emphasis on cover-based combat. And just to really press the issue home on how bad the controls are, I had to Google how to change weapons in this game twice. But even once you get used to the controls and combat, it just doesn't feel satisfying in any way, shape or form. The single and only compliment that I can give the gunplay in this game is that the enemy ragdoll physics are really funny. But I always love a good ragdoll, so it's an easy win. But that's the only win that I can actually give it. Like with a couple of Resident Evils of the past, this is a title that is meant to be enjoyed with friends, and I didn't get that chance. However, I did play it with a couple of randos that didn't really add anything, so I imagine the entire loop is far more enjoyable when you're just pissing around with your buddies. In terms of customization, when starting the missions, you'll have the option to pick between several different operatives that all do something a little bit differently, and that's what you can see next to their name, like Assault, Surveillance, and Medic as a few examples. And you can also customize the characters a little bit further with a few passive and active abilities to choose from. Not really that many, I mean 3 each? Is that it? I mean Mercanaries 3D had more customization options available, so I can't really say it's impressive at all, more like the bare basics. As I just said as well, the concept on paper is really good, and it could have been a really fun mindless zombie shooter, and even though those kind of games really aren't for me, I can still appreciate when a game does it right. This isn't one of those games. No joke, I got bored maybe 15 minutes into the game, and after 40, I shut it off and vowed never to return. It just misses the mark on every single aspect. The combat is not fun or responsive at all, the movement is clunky, the locations are odd, generic and lifeless, and there's just no signs of joy here at all. People often turn around and say that this is the worst Resident Evil game that's ever existed, and honestly, that's a load of shite. This game is definitely better than both of the Survivor games and a couple others, but it is one of the worst Resident Evils ever made, without question. There is just no incentive to play. You barely unlock anything throughout your time, you deal with every enemy the exact same way by just mindlessly filling them with bullets until they are dead or you are, and every section feels exactly the same. So it may be harsh, but I can't really review anymore because I do not have the willpower to put myself through more of this. Which is why I'm going to be putting Operation Raccoon City just above Mercenaries 3D, as I'm not going to be returning to this game anytime soon, but if I was to give it another chance, I'd go for it over the rest. Oh boy though, if you thought that this would be the most controversial game that I covered, well, you should see what's coming next, as yes, it is finally time to go back to the mainline entries, and without question, the next release would be the most controversial Resident Evil that has or ever will be made. God, what a wild year 2012 was for Capcom and the Resident Evil franchise. However, we have arrived at Resident Evil 6, and yet again this is another game that I'd never played before. So is this the worst Resident Evil game of all time, or are people slightly overreacting to a change of formula yet again? Well, let's find out. Firstly, I'd like to begin by saying that thankfully for Resident Evil 6, I was able to get a friend to experience it alongside me. So a massive thank you and shout out to CallMeRed10. She is an incredible human and you should all definitely go follow her on Twitch. Link in the description. We of course though must start as always with the story. Resident Evil 6 takes place over 4 different campaigns that all link together throughout. You can play as Leon and Helena, Chris and Pierce, Jake and Sherry, and yes, that is the same Sherry that was in Resident Evil 2, and the final one is a short campaign as Ada. The premise of the game is actually quite simple. It's all hands on deck as the story is centered around a new worldwide bioterrorist attack with a new type of virus called the C virus. All 4 campaigns revolve around the characters trying to stop the attacks and the family that are responsible for them. I'd also like to mention here that I won't really be divulging in as much of the story as I normally do, as this is the longest Resident Evil out of the bunch. To complete all 4 storylines it takes at least 20 hours. So again, just trying to sum all of that up here will be impossible. But off the rip, this campaign is actually one of my favourites in the series. Not only does it show a scale of destruction that we're yet to see in the series, which really ramps up the danger and the tension, but the thought put into every storyline and how they intertwine was something that I really enjoyed. As when I first heard how the campaign was in this game, I was scared that they wouldn't really stick the landing. But honestly, I really did enjoy the entire story that they were trying to tell here, and for me, it completely works. The next thing that I need to talk talk about are the differences between the characters in the story. For example, Jake Wesker is the melee god of the game, and one of his weapon slots is simply his fist, and my god is he fun to use. Whereas Leon stands out with his akimbo pistols, Chris is all firepower, and Ada is essentially Batman. So I'm sure, like me, you'll all gravitate to one campaign more than the others because of how they handle the main characters, and personally Jake's was so much fun to play. This also reflects the style of campaign though, as the feeling changes between them. Leon is easily the most horror-y campaign out of the bunch, whilst Chris's does feel more like a classic shooter. So some real thought has gone into the characters and the stories that they tell. Right, let's address the main reason of controversy in this game, and that's the lack of survival horror yet again. This game is a full-blown action title, and it's not even close to the scale of 4 and 5. These campaigns are meant to be fast-paced, action-heavy, and intensely cinematic. Don't get me wrong, I would still say that there are some horror aspects to here, mainly in the atmosphere and the level design, and that's why I mentioned the action in Resident Evil 4, because this is definitely the action trilogy of the series, and it makes sense that the conclusion of that trilogy would be the most balls to the walls one, as again that's just a natural progression of it, and it makes sense. The most important thing is that the game does it well, and here, yeah, they do it amazingly well in my opinion. Every single campaign from start to finish is so fun. The combat, mechanics and movement all work perfectly for the game they've created, and I don't think there were many sections in this game that I didn't enjoy. So I fear that this has been deemed a bad game just because of the lack of horror, and again, I completely understand that the horror is a massive appeal and part of the series. But calling this game bad because of the lack of it again just really isn't fair, because Resident Evil 6 is expertly put together and is one of the most impressive to play from a gameplay point of view. With that said though, let's break the mechanics down. To begin with, I would actually say that the movement feels very Resident Evil, and there doesn't appear to be that much difference between this and 5, besides the fact that you can now dive on the floor and shoot from prone, which didn't really come up that much naturally during my playthrough. Also, when it comes to combat, other than the obvious increase in melee options, the gunplay again is pretty similar to what came before, just with a lot more options. Pistols, shotgun, rifles, snipers are all going to be your main weapons of choice, and other than the faster shooting speed, they really behave exactly as you'd expect. The combat is also really satisfying. Every weapon feels fun to shoot and each have their preferred uses, meaning that adapting to the current situation is quite important. The only really big noticeable difference to me is the changes they've made to the herbs. Now every single herb you pick up must be combined to make Tic Tacs, and for every Tic Tac you eat it will heal a single block of health, as well as replenish your stamina meter. It's an odd change for sure, and it was quite funny reviving your fallen comrade by popping a smint in their mouth, but it's neither a good or a bad change, so it worked well and I adapted quickly to it. With that, it's time to discuss the enemies and the bosses, and yet again everybody, I have very little to complain about. The main enemies that you'll face throughout are very fun to deal with, and again they change a lot from campaign to campaign. For example, Leon faces the stereotypical zombie type that you'd expect, where Chris faces more advanced infections that means that they can hold weapons and shoot back, and that sort of thing. I have no complaints about any of the creatures that I faced in this game, and some of the biggest beasts and titans are actually quite scary and intimidating, so that must mean that the bosses are bad, right? Nope. The bosses, again, are really fun to engage with. There's a couple of really wacky ones like Simmons, as his mutation is that his skin breaks apart and he can instantly transform into giant T-Rex-like beasts and back, but I'll accept it because the cutscenes with this monster in them are some of the coolest in the game. Another over-the-top design one I would say is House, kind of like a gigantic energy ghost glob thing, but he was really fun to engage with, so no complaints. But all of the bosses that you'll face are exactly what you'd expect to fight in a Resident Evil. Massive, grotesque, and sometimes gooey. They tick all of the boxes. And not only that, but most bring a unique angle to them that make them more than just shoot until dead, which I always appreciate. It's also worth saying that this game looks incredible. Easily one of the best looking Resident Evils to date so far. And my favourite thing about this game is the cinematography and the cutscenes. The voice acting is fantastic, the characters all have some brilliant development and are written really well. And whilst yes, some of the cutscenes and action is a little bit goofy, I'm looking you car tsunami. You honestly cannot sit there and tell me that the shot of Simmons falling onto a spike and his blood making the Umbrella logo is an absolute fire. Not only that, but the game dodges a lot of cliches that was really refreshing. For example, there is a chapter as Chris where you must stop the firing of a missile full of the C virus. But even though you do try, you fail and the missile goes off exploding, causing everybody in the city to turn into zombies, and it was a fantastic moment. Just to reiterate though, I do understand the complaints. I can definitely understand that this game is not a typical Resident Evil experience, and if you want a slow-paced horror title, then yeah, you're not going to enjoy your time here. But if you take this game as what it is, it's extraordinarily fun from start to finish, and the amount of content in this game is ridiculous. This game is jam-packed with things to do. Honestly, the only thing that I wished happened in the main campaign that was missing was like a little bonus section where every main character comes together to fight a giant creature. Folks, I know I haven't discussed absolutely everything that I could about this game, because this section could easily be 3 hours long in itself, but all I've got to say about Resident Evil 6 is that the consensus to me is completely wrong. This is not a bad game in the slightest. In fact, it's some of the most fun I've had in this series yet. In the grand scheme of things, no, of course, this game again isn't going to be competing with anything in the top shelves. In fact, I'm going to put it just behind 5, as I do feel like I enjoy the experience of 5 just a little bit more. But to call this just a bad game outright is honestly crazy. A bad Resident Evil? Maybe. An argument could be made for that. But I was expecting a boring, horrible and lazy time, and the only section that I didn't like in the entire game was the snow mountains as Jake. That's literally it. So if you're willing to give this game the benefit of the doubt and go in with a different mindset, get a friend and spend a few hours on it. I guarantee that you'll have a lot more fun than you think you will. Resident Evil 6 is not a bad game, but that just proves you can never know what to expect with this series. But that's the second trilogy over and done with. Before the next mainline entry, we of course do have another spin-off that we need to talk about, and I was very, very excited for this one. After playing the first Revelations, I could not wait to get back into the story and see what the sequel had in store for us. And finally, it's the return of two legacy characters that we haven't seen in quite a while. So, let's dive in. Okay, for Revelations 2, Claire and Moira Burton, who yes, is Barry's kid, are kidnapped and forced to fight for their lives on a prison island, as a mysterious overseer studies them and the new virus at play, the T-Phobos. Meanwhile, Barry heads to the island and meets a young child in need, who appears to have superpowers. But Barry is here to find Moira, most importantly. Admittedly, I was actually a little bit let down by this premise, and this is something that I'll get out of the way with now. When I booted up this game, I was totally expecting a continuation from the first, and when it was quite clear that this wasn't the case, I was a little let down and confused on why they'd call it Revelations 2, when it has absolutely nothing to do with the first. In terms of gameplay, this is very much your standard Resident Evil experience, a hell of a lot more horror than the previous mainline entries, and I would say that the feel of the game connects well to the tone of the first. So I don't really need to mention movement and combat and such, because like a duck to water, you'll feel familiar with this immediately. The only addition that I can really talk about is the fact that some of the characters have to point or shine a light for you to be able to find certain pickups in the world, but it's hardly the wackiest change of the series. But there is a new angle to Revelations 2, and that's the side characters with Moira and Natalia. They both are meant to be weaker than the main character counterparts. Moira chooses not to use guns for a reason that thankfully you're told in the story, so she's more just support to help Claire as she deals with all of the main threats. And Natalia is a child, so that should be self-explanatory. And this dynamic is quite enjoyable, and my favourite parts of this game would be where the main characters use their separate skills together to overcome obstacles. With this, I'd actually like to talk about my two favourite things in this game, and what it gets really right in my opinion. Firstly, the new T-Phobos virus is my favourite out of the entire bunch, because the concept behind it is cruel, wild, and just insane. Basically, if you're infected with the T-Phobos virus, nothing will really happen to you on the surface. That is, until you get scared. This virus activates and transforms its host when they get to a certain level of fear, and this is such a cool concept to me. The idea that you'd have to fight the very instinct that will transform you is honestly terrifying as a concept, and I would love to see this virus return in some form, as I think it's perfect for Resident Evil. The next thing that I have to give immense praise to is the dynamic between between Barry and Natalia. Their characters here are one of my favourites in the entire series. To see Barry not only grow as a character, but as a father like he does in this game, it's just handled expertly. And personally, I always love it when the main character has to look after a defenseless secondary person. It truly raises the stakes so much, and Revelation gets this so right. Unfortunately though, I can't say I really enjoyed the story as a whole, outside of these 2 points. It's a very cookie cutter recipe for a Resident Evil, and sometimes it would actually border on being a little bit boring and predictable. The continuity is also a little bit weird. For example, the main villain of this game is Alex Wesker, and she is trying to find immortality. Her obsession is with Natalia, as her powers show the best chance of Alex finding immortality. So throughout the game, Alex is trying to find and kidnap Natalia. In one section, she actually does find her, and finally has her in her grasps. And this chapter ends with Alex shrieking in fear, absolutely terrified of her, and we never find out why, like at all. And considering this chapter's cliffhanger really intrigued me, the fact that we never got an answer to this pissed me off something royally. I also need to admit something. I absolutely hate Moira as a character. They tried to give her some angsty teen persona, but it really just wasn't handled well, and it makes her act like a Looney Tunes character. She says such insane, wild things for no reason. Again, a perfect example is the reunion between Barry and Moira. This should be a phenomenal moment for them in the story, finally finding each other again and forgiving past indiscretions. And the entire thing is ruined with a single line from Moira.
You did all this for me?
Yeah. Sorry it took half a year. Fucking technology.
Fuck it right up the ass.
What? Oh, come... Okay. The bosses as well can be a little bit hit or miss. Not gonna lie, I hate the fact that the main villain of this game is another Wesker. It truly dilutes her character, and I wish they would have just invented somebody totally different, as it raises more questions than it answers by having her involved here. And the main boss to me was quite underwhelming. The cinematic of her transformation is great and her design is pretty cool, but the boss fight is boring and over far too quickly for me. The others I will say are a little bit more fun. The village fight with the mutated prisoners was very tense and enjoyable, and the big scrap with the hulking Fisher was the highlight for me, but there just also aren't as many bosses in this game than I was expecting. I must also admit that the look of this game is a little bit boring as well. Besides the initial prison section, because that part looks something straight out of Saw and I loved it, but once you get out of that place, the game just starts to get a bit generic and forgettable. Again, not the worst we've seen, but by this time in the series, I'd expect a little bit more. Thankfully, we do have another point of praise, and that's the fact that puzzles are truly back. Now, they have been scattered loosely throughout the last few titles, but here is where you really get that classical feeling with the puzzles that need to be completed often in very convoluted ways, and this was great. So it's nice to talk about another positive. From the way I've been talking about this game, you may think that I'm going to call it bad, and honestly, it's not. There are without question some great things going for this game, but the great things that set this game apart are few and far between. And if I had to sum this game up in a single word, I would say average. It's an average Resident Evil, and after playing Revelations 1 and really enjoying it, this was a touch of a letdown to me, I can't lie. But as I said, there are far worse games out there, which is why I'm going to be putting Revelations 2 just above Resident Evil 0, as I do think there are a lot of better games in the series, and this one's just too middle of the road for me. It's a very average experience, so I think that's fair. From what I can tell though, Revelations 2 went down quite well, and I do hope that we get to see the series continue in some way in the future. However, the next game that we've got to talk about is yet another spin-off, and this one, I'm just gonna let this one speak for itself. We have arrived at the one and only Resident Evil game that doesn't actually have Resident Evil in the title. And folks, that should speak volumes on the experience we're about to go through. As hell, even Capcom seem to have tried to distance this game from the rest of their catalogue. Unfortunately, this is going to be another quick review because, spoiler alert, this game is hot garbage. So let me tell you exactly why. This game was meant to be a celebration of everything Resident Evil. It was for the 20th anniversary, and this game was meant to be a bit of hype and a thank you for 20 20 strong years. Only that's not what we received, as instead of a fun game that was meant to hook the players from the start, we instead got a nappy filled with piss and olives thrown into our face. For context, I absolutely hate olives. So Umbrella Corps is a tactical shooter. The story is extraordinarily light, but there is one. With the collapse of Umbrella, other companies are trying to steal their secrets, and they send groups of mercenaries to gather them. The game released as a 3v3 multiplayer experience, but as you'd expect, the servers are completely dead. So I had to go in solo, and my god, this is the most boring, useless, and pointless experience that I've had in any mainline series, let alone Resident Evil. The gameplay loop is that you and your squad go around the level collecting secret files and sometimes standing in a domination point for a couple of seconds, whilst also fighting some of the undead that roam the levels. And that's it. It's obvious this game has no substance whatsoever, no plot, no drama. The core gameplay loop is the most boring and insanely repetitive thing that I've played in many years, and I honestly cannot believe they released the game in this state. Remember how I said that Operation Raccoon City got boring after about 20 minutes? Well, that's 19 minutes longer than it took me to get bored of this shit. Considering I only played this game for 40 minutes, what can we talk about? Well, there's customization, as the first thing that I did was change my helmet colour. Ooh, how fun. Do you realise how bad a game has to be so noticeably worse than Operation Raccoon City? That game looks like Red Dead Redemption 2 compared to this. Folks, I need to move on for my own sanity, as this game is an absolute joke, and if you paid me to play this, I still feel like I'd waste my money. So just above Gun Survivor 2 is where it's going, and again, I feel like that's quite generous. This game shouldn't exist, and if you pretend that it doesn't, your life will be fuller and more enriched. With the last couple of years, Resident Evil was struggling something rotten. A lot of fans had abandoned the series, and faith in this was at an all-time low. Many thought that this was going to be the final title and the death of Resident Evil, and you can't blame them. But as we all know, Capcom listened and decided to give it another chance. One more Resident Evil game to put them back on the map and give fans not only a game that they wanted, but faith that the series could survive. Christ, they did it. Somehow they actually did it. Resident Evil 7 released in January of 2017, and finally Capcom decided to return to their roots and make another survival horror experience, but for a more modern audience. And folks, not only did this game live up to the hype and put Resident Evil right back on the throne, without this game, survival horror wouldn't be anywhere near as popular today as it is. So, let's dive in. Resident Evil 7 tells the story of Ethan Winters. His wife Mia has been missing for about 3 years, and his search for her eventually takes him to Louisiana to an abandoned house. Eventually he finds her, but unfortunately the Baker family also find him, and this game sees Ethan trying his hardest to survive this horrible situation and escape with his beloved. Now surprisingly, Resident Evil 7 is actually a first-person shooter. Gone are the tank controls and now the third-person camera. To really hone in on the fear and make this the scariest game that they could, they knew it would have to be first-person. With this, you may think that a bunch of the movement and combat would have been altered for this to work, but honestly, they didn't really change as much as you'd think. Movement still works in pretty much all the ways you'd expect it to, but the pace obviously has been slowed down intensely. Instead of running and shooting your way through the levels, you have to slowly walk from room to room, checking for items, puzzle pieces, and defending yourself from the creatures that show up. And the creatures in this game are no pushover, and it's made even tougher by the fact that you are back to limited resources, so you really need to be careful with what you're given or you will struggle more. Now, if I'm being totally honest, I'm not a fan of the basic enemies in this game that you'll fight throughout. As in Resident Evil 7, we have a new type of fungus, also known as the mold. The mold-infected monsters and bugs are what you'll be fighting mainly throughout the story. They hit hard and don't go down easy, so it was great to actually be scared of the enemies that you fight, but I wasn't really a fan of them as a character. And whilst I do understand that they couldn't have a range of characters like the zombies because it wouldn't make sense for the story, I do wish that there was just a touch more variety. However, they are scary. When one of these drop from the roof unexpectedly, my god, you will paint the room brown. But for me and everybody else, the highlight of course isn't these creatures, as the main antagonists of the game are the Baker family, and this is where they struck gold. Jack, Marguerite and Lucas are the main three that you'll interact with. You do also talk to their daughter Zoe throughout the game, but she isn't really that important in the grand scheme of things, and these three characters are truly what sell the fear of Resident Evil 7. Jack, of course, is the main main Baker resident that you'll be entangled with, as his mold infection makes him damn near unkillable, and he is the new stalker type. Whilst working your way throughout his house and surrounding areas, Jack will be in pursuit of you, and he is a fantastic character through and through. In fact, most of the big bosses of this game is the Baker family, as you just fight different versions of Jack throughout. Marguerite is another fight, and Hez is just disgustingly fun, and Lucas isn't really a boss fight in the main game, but he has a fantastic puzzle section where it feels like a Saw escape room, and all fit the story and game perfectly. But that's not all, as throughout the story you'll interact with a girl called Evelyn, and she seems to be the big bad of the game and the one pulling the strings. Now, I won't give the whole game away, as if you haven't played this you desperately need to, but Evelyn is a fantastic character with some of my favourite lore in the entire series. Throughout the game you'll also visit many different locations, from the main and iconic Baker house to the swampy exterior buildings and even a section on a gigantic boat, and all of these locations look phenomenal. However, I will say that the boat section of this game is easily the weakest component, and it does go on a little bit too long, but it's not the worst. But the look, feel and tone of the game is absolutely perfect. You'll slowly be working your way through the dark, begging that the creatures don't emerge from the shadows and ruin your life. Without question, this is the scariest Resident Evil of all time to me, and the entire journey is just a joy to go through. To the fact that I actually 100%ed this game last year, and I already have the itch to do it again. It's that enjoyable. Now, I said that I adore the story in this game, but there are some confusing moments. The main character with Ethan Winters is also not too bad in this game. He serves well as the clueless character who has no idea what's going on around him, but determined to save his wife, so he echoes the thoughts of the player well. The gun combat is also really fun and really responsive. If you take a mold's head off with a shotgun, you can feel it, and the same goes for the pistol, grenade launcher and all of the many other weapons that you'll find throughout the game. It's also worth saying that puzzles are truly back and better than ever. Every single section of this game has so many different puzzles that needed to be complete in order to get through the story, and whilst there are of course a couple that are really convoluted, for the most part they are a lot more grounded than the Resident Evils previous. Again, the puzzles are phenomenal, and it's good to see them back in full glory. The soundtrack as well also needs to be mentioned, as it's perfect here as well. Just earlier, like I said about the lack of music being a good thing, this game understands that, and it is honestly terrifying working your way through a dark room, only hearing the wind and the creaky floorboards before Jack bursts through the wall. Folks, there isn't actually that much more for me to talk about without just glazing this game more than I already have. There are a couple of small bumps along the way, and I can't pretend that there isn't. The mold just aren't an interesting enemy to face, and there isn't really many other creatures that you fight. The story can get a little bit weird, and the final boat section outstays its welcome. But honestly folks, to me this game is a masterpiece, and it's exactly what it needed to be for people to get excited about Resident Evil again. But does it dethrone the original Resident Evil remake? And honestly, no it doesn't, but fuck me, it's close. So close in fact that I'm going to be putting it just above Resident Evil 4, as the second best experience in the Resident Evil games so far. If you want a scary Resident Evil to play, this is the one that you choose. But could Capcom build this new hype building going further into the series? Well, their next game may not be another mainline entry in the way that you'd expect, but they are definitely swinging for the fences, as we need to go back to Resident Evil 2 in what looks like the most insane Resident Evil to date. We are now arriving at a new age for Capcom and the Resident Evil franchise. They decided to give the remake treatment another chance, as if it worked so well for the first game, surely lightning could strike twice in the same place. And in January of 2019, the Resident Evil 2 remake was released. Now, I'm sure we all know about this game, but just in case you don't, let's see what it's about. This is a brand new type of remake for Capcom. Instead of just updating the experience with better graphics for a more modern console, Resident Evil 2 was completely rebuilt from the ground up, with the original serving as a blueprint for what it should be. So even though the look, tone and feel of the game are totally different to the original, a lot of the same beats are still in play. The premise is exactly the same as the original, with Claire and Leon both bumping into each other at the start of the Raccoon City outbreak, and then trying to get away with their lives. For this as well, we will also be talking about Claire's storyline, since we did Leon's in the original. So let's begin with the changes to the mechanics and the combat. Firstly, this game isn't tank controls, as the camera camera is third person behind the shoulder, so that's already a wild difference compared to the original. But what this does for the horror of the game is just masterful. This does wonders for the fear of Resident Evil, as with 2 the tone is a hell of a lot darker than the original. As for the most part, your journey will just take you through dark corridors and rooms filled with the undead that are ready to pounce on you at a moment's notice. And my god, this is effective for jump scares and tense moments, as for the most part as well, the room will only be lit by your flashlight alone. With combat, I'd actually say that it echoes Resident Evil 4 more than it does 2, but it's the perfect implementation, as the slow-paced movement mixed with the shooting style makes you really feel every shot that you take. And the zombies in this game echo the original quite a lot, as they will not go down in a single headshot, and more chances than not you'll need to dump a full mag into a zombie for them to be out for the count. It's also worth saying as well that you'd once again find all of the weapons that you'd expect throughout the game. This makes the presence of the zombies that much scarier, as since this game depends heavily again on resource management, the old school feeling of choosing which zombies to engage with and which to run away with is back and better than ever. Walking into a room with 5 zombies in it really makes you have to make a split decision on what the best form of attack is, and this to me is one of the most appealing aspects of a Resident Evil, so the fact that 2 really brought this mechanic back to the foreground was great to see, and again all it does is elevate the tone of the game and the panic of dealing with these creatures. This goes for all of the creatures in the game as well, as the ones in Resident Evil 2 return in the exact same light. Lickers are back and are definitely one of the most intimidating creatures to face, and just like the original, if you choose to take them on, you better have the ammo in your belt or you'll be ripped to shreds instantly. However, not every single enemy that you'd face in the original return here, as crows, moths and spiders are nowhere to be seen. However, there is a gigantic change when it comes to one of the bosses for this title, as Resident Evil 2 Remake puts a lot more sauce into Mr. X as a character. Once he enters the ring, the game takes on a whole new level, as at any time throughout your adventures, this beefy fedora wearing maniac can and will pop up to pursue the player, and I mean at any time. You could be doing puzzles, shooting zombies, or anything in between, and then boom, Mr. X enters and will endlessly chase you down. Oh, and it's also worth saying that here, he is unkillable. To me, Mr. X is the highlight of the game, and he turns an already scary and tense experience into something else entirely, and he appears throughout the entire base game and isn't just tied to character B scenarios like he was in the original. That's not to say that Mr. X is the only returning boss though, as just like the original, you will be fighting mainly Birkin as he mutates his way through the game. Again, this was amazing to see, and I think they handled Birkin brilliantly. Every time this tank turns up, he looks even more gross, intimidating, and deadly. With Claire's story beats, honestly, the game is still really faithful to the tale that it told in the original. You still have the entire Sherry side sections, and there's actually a few new moments like the orphanage section, which is a great little stealth moment where you actually play as Sherry. You'll still work your way through all of the same sections that you'd expect, from RPD, the sewers, and the lab just to name a few, and all of the locations look absolutely brilliant, each with its own particular spin on horror and atmosphere, and I don't think there was a single frame of this game that just doesn't look phenomenal. And this of course is including the cutscenes, which have been heavily changed in appearance but still mirror the previous game, such as the importance of Marvin as a character, Annette Birkin towards the end of the game, and even the Chief Irons section. Although I will admit that I do think they handle Chief Irons as a character better in the original, as here he's a little bit one-dimensional and just the generic bad guy that immediately tries to do twisted stuff, whereas in the original he wasn't so surface level bad and had a lot more mystery to him. With everything that I've just said combined, you won't be surprised to learn that Resident Evil 2 Remake is again one of, if not the scariest games in the franchise, and you will find very little time to relax and not worry about your surroundings. I personally do think that 7 has the edge over this, but without question this is a terrifying game. Folks, there isn't actually too much more that I can discuss without really just giving tons of tiny details that are either different or the same to the original, but the main thing that you need to know about this title is that Resident Evil has never looked better, and every single moment of this game is breathtakingly beautiful and horribly creepy at the same time. The tone is absolutely nailed. The gunplay is exactly what you'd expect and it works perfectly. The characters have had some incredible improvements from the main cast to the wacky side stuff. The boss fights are grand, intimidating, and just brilliant throughout. And even though this is a completely different kind of remake than the remake of the first, it's just as perfect in its own way. And I know I keep saying this, but if you've not played Resident Evil 2 Remake yet, stop the video, stop everything that you're doing, download it, and play it immediately. For me, it is one of the top 5 horror gaming experiences that I have ever had, and this game lives up to the hype in every way imaginable. It is perfect. But is this the one to finally dethrone the original remake? Yeah. It is. This, without question, is my favourite Resident Evil of the series so far. I am blown away by this game every single time that I play it. The reception to this game, folks, was more than Capcom could ever expect, and it set a new line of games up for the company overnight, as everybody wanted remakes of the originals like this. Unfortunately, Capcom suspected that this already might be the case, and the next was on its way. Just over a year later, Resident Evil 3 Remake released, and my god, I cannot stress how much I was looking forward to this game. To know that Nemesis was going to be getting the same treatment as 2, I just could not wait to dive in and see how much they improved over the original. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case. Now, on the surface, Resident Evil 3 has received the exact same makeover that 2 did. The locations and characters look the best they ever have, and admittedly, this has to be one of my favourite starts to Resident Evil, as the game starts in a nice, quiet environment where Jill is chilling at home, and then boom, Nemesis immediately breaks through, and what begins is a really fun and intense chase sequence that definitely should have killed Jill, but we won't talk about it. Definitely an intense start, but unfortunately, after this, the game quickly starts to go downhill, and it just doesn't stop. And first, yes, of course, we need to talk about Nemesis right away, as this game, he is totally different to the original and not in the correct way. To me, Nemesis would have been the most perfect pursuer like the 2's remake of Mr. X, but this isn't what we got. As in Resident Evil 3, Nemesis isn't a pursuer at all, as he is just reduced to a series of short scripted moments, and this is such an unbelievable waste that it really pains me to talk about. Nemesis is the original pursuer, and I will never understand why they didn't make him a more dangerous Mr. X type, as that is perfect for his character and the story of 3. But no, he only appears a couple of times throughout the story, and every time he just bursts through a wall, tries to hit you, but you can just easily kill him and move on. Oh, and when I say easily kill him, I mean a single grenade easy. Nemesis, this hulking mass of pain, muscle and teeth, can be taken out with a single grenade. So even the moments where he does appear mean little to nothing, since you can just take him out faster than he jumped into the scene. That's not the only change they've made for the worse though, folks, as they have also removed so much content from the original game, namely the choices that you make throughout the story. Now, I know a lot of people, myself included, said that the choices in the original weren't the best, but isn't that the point of a remake? To take the weaker components of the original and to make them important and much more grander? Not only that, but if it was implemented correctly, this could have added so much replay value to see how your different actions can affect the game and the story, but no, they just removed it completely, which is crazy considering that this game is shorter than the original, as I was able to complete this on my very first try, day 1, in under 3 hours. But that's not the only thing they cut, as they just removed a ton of locations as well. The clock tower, the park, city hall, and the graveyard are all removed, and I can't fathom why. In fact, the game is even more linear than the original, and backtracking isn't really something you'll have to do much other than maybe once or twice throughout the entire story, and I cannot stress how much of a letdown this was. But of course, that's not it, folks. They also removed Brad's iconic death to Nemesis, and now he's just taken out by a zombie bite at the very start of the game. Jill doesn't travel to RPD either anymore, as that's something that Carlos does. And actually, speaking of Carlos, he is one of the few improvements that I can say about this game. His character here is absolutely great, and he actually also has some really funny lines as well.
Now here's a weird fucking door.
We're here for bar.
But removed content isn't the only problem, as the content that they give us here is honestly just lazy. Take the moment in the hospital where Carlos is trying to heal Jill. In the remake, they throw in this weird zombie wave section that just really speaks to how lazy the devs were with this remake. Not only is this moment just really boring, but there are so many cut corners that are screaming you in the face. Namely the fact that every zombie you kill just turns into a random pool of blood for no reason. And not only that, if you look out of the windows, you can see really bad pixelated models of zombies just wobbling in place that you also can't shoot. And this is just pathetic. Oh, and of course, I need to mention the dodge mechanic, as it does indeed return here, but instead of it being too inconsistent like the past game, here it is far too powerful, and you can dodge every single attack in the game so easily, making it completely trivial. In fact, it added more to the experience not to use the dodge at all, so that's another thing that they botched really badly. The dodge is overpowered to hell. The way that I've summed this game up best from day one to playing it most recently is that this game feels like DLC at most, and honestly I will never forgive them for fucking up Nemesis so badly as they did here. He is an absolute joke, and it pains me to see because this game could have been fantastic, but it's clear that they just didn't give a single shit about it, and it really shows. Now, it's not the worst 3 hours you'll ever spend, but it's just nothing compared to what it could and should have been. Resident Evil 3 absolutely broke my heart, so I'm going to make the very controversial choice of putting this below Code Veronica, and I would say that this is the weakest mainline entry that has ever been released with Resident Evil on it. I wanted to cry when I played this. But with that, let's move on to brighter days, as we have another spin-off, and this spin-off might actually be the reason why Resident Evil 3 felt so bare, as this was a free multiplayer game that released alongside it. So let's see if this game makes up for the remake. Resident Evil Resistance is a brand new type of online experience. You either play as the Masterminds, which are the iconic villains throughout the series, or the Survivors, which are just a bunch of random teenagers. The Survivors must complete puzzles, kill zombies, and make their way through 3 layers of rooms, whilst the Mastermind tries to kill them and put a stop to the run. Playing as a Survivor, things are actually really familiar when it comes to the movement and combat, although here every character do have unique upgrades and powers, so finding your favourite of the bunch is a lot of fun here, as there are plenty of options. Masterminds are a tough trickier, as they play as a sort of card deck. If you want to spawn a group of zombie dogs in, then you'll have to wait until you have the card and the energy to use it. It goes a lot deeper than that, but that's the basic gist. And just like the Survivors, the Masterminds have a lot of unique angles and options that they can use, but as you can see, for the most part, you'll be observing the Survivors and doing your actions through the cameras, and messing with them through that. On the surface, folks, this game doesn't seem that bad actually. There is plenty of options and upgrades, both cosmetic and not. There's a decent range of choice as some of the Masterminds you can play as Spencer, Nikolai, Daniel Fabron, whoever the hell that is, and Alex Wesker and Annette Birkin. Okay, definitely some weird choices when it comes to the Masterminds, but I'm not mad, as the big appeal to this is that every single Mastermind has a different ultimate BOW that they can use, and this is one of the only times where you don't play through the cameras. For example, Nikolai can summon Nemesis, and for a brief moment you can control him and go absolutely batshit on your opponents. Mr. X and Birkin are also a couple of examples, but there are also some really odd choices, as Spencer controls laser grids and Alex Wesker summons Audrey too. So some are clearly better than others. Now honestly folks, I can't really talk too much about this game in its current state, as the servers are pretty much dead, and the ones that aren't, you will not want to play in, as this game has a huge problem. There are no matchmaking preferences, and this is something I remember being a really big problem the first month of its release, and even more so now. For example, my Mastermind character could be level 4, and I could be very much starting to learn the basics, but the game will throw you into a lobby with 4 level 500 survivors who have every perk unlocked and the most streamlined inventory you've ever seen, meaning that because I've got nothing of use yet, they absolutely embarrass me without a second thought, and this got frustrating so quickly. This just took any of the fun that this game could hold and threw it out of the window. I never really found this game that fun, to be honest, in practice. In these sort of games, I always prefer being the killer or the mastermind, but just clicking cards and spawning zombies isn't fun, and the balancing for this game is honestly just non-existent. Not only that, but once they dropped it, Capcom just kind of forgot about it, and we hardly got any updates or tweaks or new content. I remember they released Jill at some point, but you'd expect this game to eventually have so many options for masterminds and survivors, but nothing of substance was added, meaning that it got old really quickly and I didn't play much of it after launch. It was a decent idea on paper and could have really been a good little online experience, but Capcom just kind of left it alone and it slowly withered and died. It's a bizarre choice, but that's the one they made. Which means, yes, I don't really think that much of this game because there isn't really much of a game to be had. So I'm going to be putting it just above Operation Raccoon City, and yeah, that seems fine. Once again folks, Capcom seem to have taken the foot off the throttle again with the last two entries, as they were definitely not as well received as they'd hoped. But don't worry, it's time for a brand new mainline release, and this one would break the internet. It's time to trek into the village folks as we arrive at Resident Evil 8 and the direct continuation of 7. Now I don't need to mention the hype for this game, it was through the roof, and I can at least think of 2 reasons why that was the case. So let's see if Village is another fantastic continuation or if it's another weaker entry. To begin with, the story. At first, things seem lovely. Ethan and Mia are back together and looking after their new child Rose before boom, Chris steps in and game ends her. We are then kidnapped but manage to escape in the middle of nowhere, but we now need to save our daughter. After encountering a village full of werewolves, we then meet the villains of the game and the ones responsible for her kidnapping, as we meet the 4 lords and Mother Miranda, who is the one in charge. Over the course of the game, we need to take on these 4 lords and recover vials that contain body parts of our daughter, and hope that we can put her back together. An absolutely wild concept folks, it truly is, but my god, I was hooked from the beginning here, I really was. But let's get into the details. Firstly, the mechanics, gunplay and combat all pretty much mirror Resident Evil with the first person perspective, although this game does have a slightly faster pace. Imagine, if you will, the perfect blend of Resident Evil 4 and 7. That would kinda get close to this if you understand. Now speaking of mirroring 4, we do have an old mechanic returning in a new light, as the Merchant is back. Now it's not the exact same dude, as here we deal with the phenomenal Duke instead. He works identically to the one in 4 though, as throughout the story, every time you find him you can buy guns, ammo and upgrades, as well as selling the many treasures that you've accumulated throughout, and he is a great addition. The homies love Duke. The basic creatures that you'll fight as discussed though will mainly be Lycans, and they are so much more fun to engage with than the mold in the previous game, and a lot more varied as there are different types throughout. Not only that though, the variety of enemies is a lot better than 7, as this game is broken up into different sections. Whenever you're in a new location, you'll have new unique enemies to face, which is fantastic. But we can't beat around the bush any longer. We need to discuss my favourite aspect of this game, and that is the 4 lords. Lady Dimitrescu, Donna Beneviento, Salvatore Moreau and Heisenberg. These are some of the strongest and most appealing villains in any of the Resident Evils, and they make the pacing for Village one of the strongest in the series, as throughout the game you can go from location to location killing these lords so that you can finally reach Miranda, and these lords are some of the most unique and best characters in the entire series. Each lord is completely fleshed out and their character work is fantastic, as each behave totally differently and all have their own unique goals and agendas. So every 2 hours the pace of the game is totally changed as you deal with each lord individually. First is Lady Dimitrescu, and her section revolves around vampires in a gigantic mansion. This section feels like a classic Resident Evil, as you make your way through the many puzzles and fights that take place in it. After that it's Beneviento, whose power revolves around controlling dolls, and her section in the game is easily one of the craziest and scariest in the game. I won't give the reason why just in case, but just know that one part of this section will haunt your nightmares. After that it is the disgusting creature Moreau, and his character is again one of my favourites, as it's the first time I've ever felt bad for a villain. His motive for wanting to beat Ethan and do well is simply so that the other lords don't make fun of him, and genuinely this dude can break your heart at a couple of times. And finally we have Magneto, I mean Heisenberg, but you'll see the comparisons as this dude can control metal and his section revolves around a gigantic metal work factory, with the enemies inside reflecting this. I cannot sing the praises of these characters enough, and it is such an amazing thing to go from lord to lord and feel like you're playing a different style of Resident Evil with its own themes. Easily one of the strongest, if not the strongest Resident Evil story to date in my eyes. I absolutely adored every section of this game. Now I will say that to begin with, Ethan's character is slightly weaker than what came before, but the story ends on such an incredible high moment for him, so thankfully it ends on a great note. As to begin with, he makes stupid decisions and is a little bit of a whiny bitch, but they end him just right, so I can forgive a weaker start. However, I do have one small complaint about the Lords, and that's not even the game's or Capcom's fault. The only thing that I wish they did differently was not make Lady Dimitrescu the first Lord that you deal with. She shot to infamy straight away, and she's one of my favourite of the bunch, so it was upsetting that she was the first to go. But it's not Capcom's fault that she broke the internet, so I'm not even mad. Just in an ideal world, I would have liked to have seen more of her character. The lore of this game is also something really special, and without saying too much, Resident Evil Village lore is one of the most important in the entire series, because this game truly is the catalyst for every single virus, infection and problem that the series tells. Again, I won't say too much, but the Megamycetes is the reason once you find out what that is. It's brilliant. Folks, I don't really have any negatives to say really. To me, this is one of the strongest campaigns of the bunch. The action is great, the puzzles and locations are brilliant, the villains are some of the best in the franchise, and to me this is one of the best Resident Evil experiences somebody can have. The story, the pacing, the music, god, just everything is well thought out and constructed, and the ending of this game really stayed with me and broke my heart a little bit. Resident Evil Village is absolutely one of my favourite of the bunch, which is why I'm going to make another controversial take in putting this just above 7, because I personally think the story, the characters, the gameplay, the mechanics is just that little bit better than 7, and this game fixes a lot of the smaller problems in 7 that players had. It's amazing to say that this game lived up to the hype, and to me it's crazy how varied and different these Resident Evil games can be. Nothing proved that more than doing this video, so I'm really thankful for that, because it's made me look at the series in ways that I never have before. But we're not done yet, folks, as like Resident Evil 3, Village also came with a new online experience that released alongside it. Another risk, but let's see if this one pays off. We have arrived at the final spin-off for the series, and this, just like Resistance, was a game that came free alongside Village. It's yet again another multiplayer experience, so let's see if this is better than the last that we were given. Again, the concept of this game is actually quite simple. Reverse is a third-person multiplayer shooter. The idea is that you join with your character of choice, and your job is to get the most kills within 5 minutes. But as you'd expect, there is a lot more at play here. Firstly, the biggest appeal to this game is actually what happens if you die. As if you're taken out, you then transform into some of the wildest and deadliest creatures in the series, depending on how many virus vials that you die with. Die with none, and you'll spawn as a blob that can't really do much but explode. With one vial, you can turn into a Lycan, a Hunter, or even Jack Baker, if you're lucky. And if you die with 2, that's when the Tyrants come out to play, as Tyrant X or Nemesis will be available. This concept to me is one of my favourites of the weird spin-off games. The experience for this is just meant to be a 5-minute long match full to the brim with chaos and death, and for the most part that's exactly how all of my games went. Taking place across some of the most iconic locations for Resident Evil, I really thought that this game had some strength behind its core components, and not only do you have a great inventory of main characters to choose from, with Chris, Leon, Jill, Claire, Ada as a couple of examples, but each character once again works in their own way, with their own abilities that set them apart from each other. Once again, Leon can go apeshit with the akimbo pistols, Chris can grow rock-like skin and take reduced damage for a short while, and Jill is able to shred enemies with her flaming knife as a couple of examples. Now, Reverse doesn't actually have the best reputation, and a lot of fans weren't interested in this game in the slightest, and I found that really wild actually. For a free game that released alongside another mainline title, this is actually a really fun time, and it's so easy to pick up, meaning that if you just fancy shooting stuff for half an hour, this might be the perfect game to do that. However, the Resistance problem is back, and I reckon it's actually the reason for this game's death, and its online servers getting pulled, and that's the fact that they didn't do anything with it after its release. You once again expect this to eventually have so many options throughout, with new tyrants and mutant types and main characters being added, but no. Once this dropped, the only thing that they really added was a village map to fight on and a couple of weird nameless survivors that don't really matter, and this was just painful. Imagine the roster if Marguerite, Albert and Alex Wesker, Jack Norman, Alexia Ashford were all slowly introduced to the game as a few examples. The catalogue that this could have been would be fantastic, but again, since there was no innovation or regular updates offering more content, this game does get boring eventually, which is why I didn't return to it outside of my initial obsession when it first released. It's so weird that Capcom released this game knowing the potential it could have, but nothing was done with it, and again, it's just another waste of potential, as I personally think this game is really fun, and it's exactly what I needed for a mechanic standpoint. So unfortunately, the game didn't add up to much, and now it's actually unplayable, which is a crying shame. That's why personally I'm going to be putting this just above Dead Aim, as if this game had some love and some actual content added to it, I reckon it would be still going strong today. But since we got a half-baked game, I think above Dead Aim is fair. Folks, with that though, we are at the final entry. We have covered so many games and so many different styles of Resident Evil experiences, but we're at the final one, until the release of Requiem, of course. And it's nice to go out with a bang, as the final title is yet another remake. And the internet made Capcom know that this one they could not fuck up. But did they? Here we are, folks. Resident Evil 4 Remake came out in 2023, and I was so excited to play this. However, I never actually got around to it until this video. So the final entry in one of the most anticipated games in the series I've never actually played before. So I could not wait to see if Capcom struck gold again, or if they ruined one of their most beloved games. Resident Evil 4 story-wise, as you'd expect, follows pretty much the exact same beats of the original story. Leon travels to Spain to find the president's missing daughter, and there we deal with cults, monsters, and Ada. Other than a new framing of the scenes and some tweaks to the story plots, it actually follows the original pretty much identically. With movement and combat once again, it's more of the style that we're familiar with. Similar to 2 and 3 remakes, it's over the shoulder, but it's definitely a little bit faster paced, just like 4 was to the original trilogy. It gave me hope that this remake was made with more love than the last. It's also worth saying right off the bat, folks, that yes, this game is absolutely beautiful, and they've done a phenomenal job at recreating the locations and the characters. Good lord, they all look fantastic. So yes, from a visual level, this is the greatest Resident Evil has ever looked. It is stunning. In terms of mechanics, everything that made Resident Evil 4 so enjoyable is back. The merchant has arrived and he is as great as ever, and even has a new component to him, as throughout the game he will give you contracts. It could be to kill rats or shoot blue medallions, but every contract gives the player a unique currency to unlock some really powerful items, but you really have to go out of your way for them. Me personally, I did all of them that I could, and they were all handled quite well in my opinion. The partner system with Ashley also returns in pretty much the same way as before, as not only do you have to worry about your own health and safety, but making sure Ashley is fine and dandy as well. But I will say that Ashley's character in this is also a lot better than the original. There's a new story beat here in which throughout the game Ashley slowly loses herself to Las Plagas, and it makes for some really tense and interesting moments later in the game that work a lot better than the original in my opinion. And speaking of character improvements though, we need to talk about Louis as a character. Here he is a lot more involved than the original, and I absolutely loved him. They've given him a lot more screen time and sauce that means that you're more invested in him, and that's a fantastic thing. His playful attitude is brilliant, and he actually partners up with Leon for many parts of the campaign, and whenever he joins you, it's bound to be a good time. However, there is one character who is slightly worse this time around, and unfortunately that is Ada. Now what I'm about to mention is something that I didn't even know was a common consensus on the internet, and that's the fact that her voice acting is a little bit weird compared to the rest of the cast. Now I've actually found out that the internet really laid into the voice actress for her and made her quit the internet, and honestly, that's fucking disgusting. I can't even say that it's the worst performance that I've heard, but the tone of her dialogue just doesn't match with the people around her, and it feels like she only had maybe 1 or 2 takes per line. And that was the biggest issue for me, not the actual quality of the voice acting, as it's not even a big problem, it's just a little noticeable, that's all. Other than Ada though, all of the characters, both heroes and villains, all look absolutely incredible, and it's the best their characters have ever been. This also goes for the creatures and the boss fight, as throughout the game you'll fight exactly the same enemies that you did in the original, and they work pretty much the same as before, but they all just look 10 times better. I was invested in this game straight away, and it didn't let me down a single time. The tone for the remake, I would also say, is a little bit darker than the original 4, as many times throughout the story you'll be in the dark with your flashlight, scared to move around every corner in case something horrible takes your head off, and this is something that I felt a lot more here than the original. So I would say that the horror itself is also handled a little better, but that makes sense considering how amazing the 2 remake was. By this time Capcom knew how to handle horror in their games, and here it shows. But we do have a couple more new additions as well. The biggest and newest would be Leon's parry system. In the remake the knife is a lot more useful, as if you get familiar with it you can save yourself a lot of pain, and give Leon some pretty badass moments as you parry a chainsaw with a butter knife. Unlike the dodge mechanic in 3 as well, I would say that this system is perfectly implemented. I never felt like I was overpowered with this attack, as it really does take some getting used to, and you will not be perfect with it at first. So learning this and improving over the game is really enjoyable and leads to some brilliant high-octane moments where you're surrounded by infected of all kinds and you get some pretty badass reflections done with your knife. The last thing that I need to mention as well is that Leon is capable of a small amount of stealth now. You absolutely can totally ignore this mechanic if you like, and it changes nothing about the game, but the occasional moment presents itself, and insta-killing an oblivious moron feels fantastic. So I would say that this is a welcome new addition as well. Without questions, folks, Capcom handled this remake beautifully. Pretty much every single component of the original has been enhanced and serves the game better this time around. From the characters and their story arcs, the layout of the world, as well as the base mechanics and gunplay. Everything here feels fantastic. So again, there isn't really much more for me to talk about, as anything more would just be me complimenting every single little thing that I could potentially find, and that alone would take hours. Capcom knew how important this game was to get right, and credit to them, they really knocked the remake out of the park. And this is easily one of the best Resident Evil experiences a player can have. Which is why, for me, Resident Evil 4 Remake is going to be taking the number 3 spot. As I do prefer the remakes of 2 and 1 over it, but again, it's so unbelievably close. And to me, if I wanted to play a more action-oriented Resident Evil that still had some horror, this is the perfect choice. But with that, there we are. Folks, we are done. Every single Resident Evil has been played, and we have my final ranking list. Now, I hope I've done every game here justice, as this is a series that I thoroughly love through and through. But if you do disagree with my list, let me know in the comments what your favourite Resident Evil is. As to be honest with this series, an argument could be made for most of the games being in somebody's number 1 slot, but this one is mine. So, all that's left to say, folks, is thank you so much for watching. This, without question, is my biggest and my most ambitious video of all time, and I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you watched it all the way from start to finish, then I'm honestly lost for words, and I really appreciate you watching all the way through and hopefully enjoying it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, as we're going to be hopping straight into another iconic horror series for the next every video. If you're looking for more right now though, I do have videos on Mortal Kombat, Sniper Elite, Hitman and the Jak and Daxter series, so if you want to hear more of a British idiot's opinions on games, then I'm sure you'll enjoy those as well. Finally, another massive thank you to StarCraft X for sponsoring the video. It really means a lot. Folks, go and check out their game. But it is clear that I have taken enough of your time, folks, so what I'll say is thank you all so much again for watching. It means more than you could possibly know, and I will hopefully see you all in the next video. So until then, take care. Bye-bye for now.